Can I add one more thing before I forget? I really appreciated John's comments about your staff who may be on our committees and the importance of learning from them what we're talking about. And that especially plays in with our field of study committees and our programs of study, because these are going to be critical to the process, and we need to make sure that if you have a representative on one of those committees, that they're communicating with you and letting you know what we're talking about, because communications is always difficult. So however you can help us with that, we would appreciate it.
And John, I hope you can hang around, because I think maybe once we get into some of these agenda items, such as dual credit, we can talk about some things that might, and transfer that might be helpful. One quick question, though, is you said one of the interim items was system and geological expansion. Is that just for four-year universities, or are they looking at community colleges and things of that sort?
So the charge doesn't specify. Now, this was an issue that was particular to universities last time. So there was legislation based on a coordinating board recommendation that was limited to universities. Now, the charge doesn't limit it to universities, but I mean, really the issue only kind of makes sense in terms of a university focus.
Okay, well, I assumed that, but I just didn't want anything flying under the radar. If it turns different, we would like to know.
Absolutely. And usually as the hearings get scheduled and they start to come up, we'll get a little more sense of what particular aspects of this charge do they really want to go into based on the information they're asking for, the analysis. The other thing I'll say is that the committee will decide who they want to invite to testify, but it's important that the sector is represented directly. So please, if there's a hearing that you want to have input on, make sure you're contacting the chairman. Make sure that you're making your position known.
Chair Walker, certainly appreciate the interim studies with regards to, they almost seem at opposite ends with dual credit and transferability. One's working, one may not be working as well as we'd like. But I think it's really important that we specify applicability versus transferability, because all the courses transfer. They just don't apply to the degree. And I think that's really where taxpayers, families, and the state are looking at, last I saw, approximately $150 million annually in expended resources that we could be saving the state, the families, et cetera.
Just one other quick question. The interim study items have been listed. Have there been any substantive discussions or other activities at the Capitol, or is it just here's what we want to talk about?
Not yet. I mean, honestly, they're kind of tuned out right now. The focus is really, the primaries will be in March, so a lot of members are back in their districts, trying to make sure that they're working for their districts. We have not had any particular substantive conversations around the charges, but again, I expect after the new year, some of the focus will come back, and we will have that.
And I do know that TACC and CAD and TCCTA, which is the teachers aspects, will be holding a legislative workshop in the middle of December, so to get going. Any other questions or comments concerning John or the legislative update?
Yes, I have one. You mentioned Hurricane Harvey. I know particularly for the colleges, universities in Southeast Texas, this is something that, even though we are amidst a recovery, systemically, this is going to be an issue for those 2-year, 4-year universities for years to come. Can you provide maybe some sense of any conversations you've have heard of as it relates to funding or additional programs, training, what have you, as it relates to Hurricane Harvey?
There's a couple of things I'd mention. So the charge that I'd listed was to the House Higher Education Committee. The House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Finance Committee have also been given Hurricane Harvey charges. And they're already in the midst of having hearings and really trying to determine, what are the funding needs for our communities that were impacted by the hurricane. So that's one element of it. I do think the House Higher Education Committee, it's a policy committee as opposed to a funding committee. So I think they're going to be more focused on what are the longer term changes that might need to be made to higher ed, such as, how do you ensure that we have the programs in place to meet the workforce demand. I'll also mention, you may be aware that the Coordinating Board, TEA, and TWC were appointed by the governor to a tri-agency effort to examine the workforce needs in light of the hurricane. And so the three agencies, they had regional meetings in Corpus Christi, in Houston, and in Beaumont to meet with stakeholders, institutions, ISDs, business, unions, local elected officials to better understand what are the immediate workforce needs, but also longer term, what do we need to do to get the workforce to where it needs to be in light of the hurricane. And we're actually in the process of working on the final report that'll come out of that tri-agency effort.
Do you have a target date for the final report, the delivery of the final report?
I don't have that, but we do expect it soon. Right.
Any other questions for Mr. Wyatt or comments? Next on the agenda is the update concerning activities of negotiated rulemaking committees. Mary Smith is here with us today, who's the Assistant Deputy Commissioner for Academic Planning and Policy. And I think as discussed at the last meeting, several bills from the legislature required the coordinating board to develop administrative rules to have the rulemaking process. Since the last meeting, I think you guys have undertaken that process, and I think you're here today to provide us with a brief overview of this process.
Yes, sir. Actually, I'm really here to just give you an update on where we are with the 4 rules that I had shared with you at your last meeting. So just to give you an update, there's a lot of detailed information on our website if you really want to scrutinize it. And if you are wanting to do that, all you have to do is get onto our main website and then just type in the search engine, negotiated rulemaking, and everything will come right up. So I'll just be brief in my comments and glad to answer any questions that you might have. And thank you for having me. As you might remember, there was the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee on Workforce Continuing Education. That was the result of House Bill 2994, which amended the Texas Education Code by adding subchapter L to Chapter 130 and added Workforce Continuing Education. The legislation required the coordinating board to adopt rules for the administration of the new subchapter by using the negotiated rulemaking process. The committee did reach consensus at their first meeting on October the 30th, and those rules are currently posted in the Texas Register. They were posted on November the 17th, and the 30-day comment period will end on December the 17th. And just as from background information for you, if we receive a comment during that 30-day comment period, what we do as a negotiated rulemaking committee procedure is we make a suggestion as staff on how to respond to that comment. But we submit that to all of the members of the committee, and then via email, they either decide to accept or reject or modify or whatever. We try to do everything via email with the comment period. So far, we have not received comments on that. So if you are interested in making comments, you'd want to do that by the 17th, and there's instructions on the website on how to do that.
Mary, let me ask the committee, does everybody know what that bill is about? Do you know the bill number? I don't, unless I missed it, I don't think you said what the intent of the bill.
Yes, it's House Bill 2994, and it was amending Texas Education Code Chapter 130 by adding subchapter L, Workforce Continuing Education, and I have lots of details here.
Well, maybe Rex could say there's, I think they need to know what was the bill trying to do, and I think Rex
sure.
maybe can.
I'm sorry, I had shared this with you last time, but if you would like a
We have a
full
number
update.
of new committee members, Mary.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll just give a quick overview of the bill. This is the bill that opened up continuing education coursework to essentially high school students. Juniors and seniors primarily, so those exiting the sophomore year, and it allows funding for continuing education courses to that student population. It also created some exemptions for students who have reached, what do they call it,
Disability minorities.
The disability minorities, which is essentially students that are out of high school but are no longer under parental authority, some students that are incarcerated. So there's some exceptions to this for special populations where training may be particularly helpful, actually. But it does open up continuing education coursework for funding to juniors and seniors in high school.
Any questions about that process, or we'll go ahead and move on. The Negotiated Rulemaking Committee on Open Educational Resources Grant Program. That was the result of Senate Bill 810, and that legislation added Section 61.0668 regarding an Open Educational Resources Grant Program, which Rex can explain in just a minute. Well, I'll just defer to him. Well, the idea is to make incentivize faculty to use open educational resources. And Rex can give you much more detail, and we have the bill here and the rule. But essentially, we were charged with adopting rules to administer the program. And again, the committee members did reach consensus on November the 1st when they had their first meeting, and those rules have been posted in the Texas Register, and the comment period will end again on December the 17th. Rex?
That particular piece of legislation did two things. One is it authorized the coordinating board to enter into a feasibility study for setting up an OER, Open Education Resources Repository. And we're in the process of conducting that feasibility study. And in fact, sometime in the early spring, we'll probably be contacting some institutions for feedback and to participate in a couple of focus groups and some discussion about this. But the negotiated rulemaking actually dealt with the second part of that legislation that provided for $100,000 per year over the biennium to give out grants to folks to develop open education resources. And so the sort of the ground rules of the RFA were set up through the negotiated rulemaking process, and we hope to have that. In fact, we have it on the next December and January calls and board meeting agendas to approve the issuance of that RFA in sometime in either late January or early February for this coming year, and then we'll issue another one for the following year. And we anticipate these will be rather small grants because they will go directly to faculty members to develop the open education resources for a particular course.
The next bill that we had for a negotiated rulemaking committee was Senate Bill 1091, and that relates to limitations on the courses that might be offered for dual credit by school districts and public institutions of higher education. Specifically, it amends specific sections of the education code. And again, that one required that the coordinating board and the Texas Education Agency coordinate and adopt rules based on a negotiated rulemaking process. And again, they reached consensus on their first meeting on November the 1st. And again, those rules are posted in the Texas Register and will be there until, we'll receive comments for the 30 days until December the 17th.
And that particular piece of legislation actually limits the courses that you can offer. Legislation prior to this, and it always limited what may receive funding, but this actually limits what may be offered to core courses, career and technical education courses, foreign language courses, courses that are involved in an early college high school program as defined in the Public Education Code, which includes not only what we traditionally think of as an early college high school, but can also include future PTACC academies and some other things that are designated under the rubric of early college high school. And then the piece of the legislation that was that really needed to be determined by negotiated rulemaking was the part that said, and other programs leading to certificates or associate degrees. And the committee essentially defined that as long as it was leading to and could be demonstrated to lead to a board-approved certificate or associate degree, then it would be acceptable.
And then final one that we're working on, the meeting won't be until Tuesday, December the 5th, so I'm not able to really tell you a lot about what will transpire. But essentially, this one is the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee on Data Request Reevaluation. Really not a result specifically of the last legislative session, I should say, but specifically the Texas Education Code, Section 51.406, directs the coordinating board to reevaluate our rules and policies to ensure that the data requests that we make of our institutions make sense. And so the idea of that legislation is that we consult with the institutions of higher education and identify any data requests that are appropriate either for removal of our board rules or modification of those rules. So that is in the process of being set up. There's a long list of data, and then there's certain discussion items that will be addressed by the committee on December the 5th.
I think one could add, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in some cases it might be a recommendation to the legislature regarding legislation that requires us to collect certain information as well. So in some cases it's coming directly from us. In other cases it's coming through us, from the legislature via us. And so also I'd like to point out we weren't required to do negotiated rulemaking on this particular one, but we thought it was a good process and the best way to consider the topic.
That really concludes my part here. If you have any questions, I'm glad to answer any questions. I do encourage you to take a look at our website. It's quite comprehensive, the negotiated rulemaking website, and we appreciate any comments, and like I said, we share them with the committee members, and then we go through a consensus process via email. And then, of course, if they really have significant comments where we have to call the committee together. What happens is that until everything is finalized, the committee remains intact, and then we disband the committee once the final process is complete. Okay. Thank you so much.
Any other questions concerning negotiated rulemaking? If not, we'll move on to our next agenda item. As you all know, the updates from the Texas Association of Community Colleges and the Community College Association of Texas Trustees are standing agenda item, and I hope remain that way. Today we have Jacob Frade with us, and he's going to also introduce Dr. Rose Martinez. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Walker. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rex. So I'm Jacob Friday. I represent the Texas Association of Community Colleges, all 50 public community colleges in this great state of ours, and such a privilege to serve in that capacity. I'm coming up, Chairman Walker, our 2 years of duty in this space, and I would tell you every day that I come into the office, it continues to be exciting and very rewarding at the end of the day, even if that day ends up being after dark now that we have reached the winter months. I wanted to perhaps provide some framing comments for the months ahead as we get ready for the 2019 session, and then segue in introducing my colleague, Dr. Rose Martinez, who joined us in serving the community college trustees in that way. And maybe as a way of framing the comments, let me just say to you, for those of you who don't know me, I am a consummate optimist. Was born an optimist and will probably die in that way, optimistically going into the next life. And with that, I would say that sort of irrespective of what we know to be the case today in terms of the challenges to our great nation and to our great state, I am optimistic about the future of the state of Texas. And I am optimistic in part, perhaps in large part, because I am bullish about our community colleges. I have seen and witnessed and talked to all of our leaders across this great state. Each one of our community colleges is engaged in very significant work in the guided pathways, which challenges our colleges to do major rethinking, redesign of how we matriculate our students to and through college, and onto our university colleagues. And that is not insignificant work that our colleges are doing, frankly, voluntarily, frankly, absent of any kind of policy directive, and they're doing it because that's the right thing for our students. And that makes me very optimistic about our work ahead. I'm also optimistic because we have a great collaboration, not just with the colleagues at this agency, but also our colleagues at TEA. With Commissioner Morath has been an incredible, refreshing leadership for that agency that is responsible for the 5.5 million students who we serve and who we will serve at some point as they come through public schools and onto our colleges. And then also we have a good relationship certainly with the commissioners at the Texas Workforce Commission. But let me talk about the coordinating board. The coordinating board has been a great partner of ours. And I can only speak for the last 2 years as I've been here. Even as we were getting ready for the 2017 session, we collaborated on data. We collaborated on making sure that their data and our data were one and the same, and where we had differences, that we worked out the differences in this room or at the TACC office and not under the state capitol, where the data then becomes a different conversation. In the middle of session, specifically with regards to the continuing education bill that you heard about earlier, this is House Bill 2994. We collaborated not just with Dr. Peebles and the colleagues at the coordinating board, but to making sure that the language that we ultimately decided on was the right language, whether that was going to be a high school junior or a student who had achieved the age of 15 was something that we worked together to make sure that we got it right, so that we got it right for our students. And that collaboration has expanded not just through the bill adoption, but all the way to where we are now, which is negotiated rulemaking. And they have been great partners in us to make sure that we get this right for our students. Specifically with regards to dual credit, I would tell you that in the issue of dual credit, we come to it perhaps slightly different with regards to our approach. We come to it perhaps slightly different with regards to maybe some of the hypotheses that we have on dual credit, but we come to it in a single frame that we have to get it right for students of Texas. That dual credit is and can be an important part of the 60/30 framework that we've laid out for the great state, that dual credit has provided great opportunity for students in this great state, and we have now collaborated with the coordinating board extensively. We collaborated on data. 2 years ago, we knew that we had some gaps in data, and we worked with Julie Eklund and her team to make sure that the data that they had and the data that we collected from our colleges synced up. We also worked with TEA to make sure the data the TEA and the coordinating board were using to inform some of the discussions were data that were available to the entire community, not just the community colleges, but our superintendent colleagues as well. About 9 months ago, the University of Texas System and TACC put together a dual credit task force of stakeholders. These are university stakeholders, community college stakeholders, school district stakeholders. The coordinating board, Texas Workforce Commission, and TEA have been actively involved for the last 9 months in meeting time and again on a number of issues affecting dual credit. We are scheduled to meet sometime in mid-December. It may well be the second to the last meeting before a report is put out by the task force. I will tell you that our collaboration with the coordinating board in that task force has been very, very helpful to the discussions. Are we at consensus yet? No, not by a long shot. But I think that we reached a lot of good discussions on the issues that need to be tackled, and frankly, on the issues where we still need further data. And I think that's an area where further for future collaboration. As we approached the 2017 session, we asked the legislature for a 2-year reprieve on any major policy recommendations or changes to dual credit. By and large, they honored that request. We heard earlier about the one dual credit bill that has to do with the kinds of courses that can be offered. I think that was a very sort of good, it was a good improvement to the system that we have. But our expectation going forward is that the legislature will in 2019 seek from us, frankly, demand from us good recommendations, thoughtful recommendations on dual credit going forward, so that as we complete the remaining 12 years of the 60/30 text plan by 2019, that we provide recommendations on dual credit access and dual credit funding, on dual credit mode of delivery that makes sense for the next generation of students. And I think we're going to get it right. I know we will get it right. We have to get it right. I want to also specifically call out the good collaboration that we've had with the coordinating board with regards to a major piece of legislation that frankly kind of went under the radar a little bit, and that is House Bill 2223. House Bill 2223 requires all public colleges and universities to ramp up their use of co-requisite as a model of delivery of developmental education courses. This is a major reform. I'll say that again. This is a major reform of developmental education. We collaborated with the coordinating board as the bill was going through the process. They and us were involved in some of the same meetings with the author of those bills. And as those bills went through the House and Senate process, and we have been collaborating ever since the bill was adopted, ever since working closely with the staff here. Dr. Joel Booker specifically, I will call him out, has been a great colleague with us in making sure that even as the first drafts of the proposed rules are in development, that we were working with them to make sure that we get that bill right. I believe that co-requisite can and will work for our students. I believe that the continued collaboration that we have had with the coordinating board and with the technical assistance yet to come, but it is in development for us, that we will get it right, not just for those students who are in developmental ed at our community colleges, but all students who are in developmental education across this great state. And so I want to call that out, although we are still very much in the infancy stage of implementation of that legislation. Certainly, it is also my hope that as we unearth perhaps areas in the legislation that could see some improvements, that we would collaborate together and see some recommendations for the 2019 session for iterations that perhaps we wouldn't have seen a year ago or 2 years ago, or even at this moment. And then lastly, perhaps as an invitation for the spirit of collaboration, the great state of Texas has a very robust data system, perhaps an envy of much of the rest of the nation with regards to the longitudinal data systems that we have in terms of being able to monitor student progress, not just at public schools, but through our many institutions of higher education and all the way to workforce entry. I would invite the coordinating board and I would invite this council, Chairman Walker, to engage in a good, long collaboration about how we can continue to share data, and particular data that is still sort of forthcoming. Back to the issue of dual credit, there is a study, a very comprehensive study that the coordinating board has commissioned with regards to dual credit. There are some data that we don't have yet that is still forthcoming, and I certainly would invite a continued conversation so that we don't find ourselves, and I'm not suggesting that we will, but that we don't find ourselves reviewing a draft bill late summer or early fall of next year that had some data assumptions and conclusions that for the first time that we reviewed them, and that perhaps at that point it was too late to unring that bell. So let's have that conversation as we move forward. And with that, I would say, Chairman Walker, the other reason that I am optimistic is because we have a brain trust that has now grown exponentially in the building, and that is that Dr. Rose Martinez has joined us and it serves as the Director of Trustee Strategies, working with us to provide leadership to the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. And with that, may I introduce Rose Martinez.
Thank you for inviting me to come, and want to say a special thank you for Chairman Walker, who actually sits on the TACC. Sorry about that. Let me just say thank you. I appreciate being here, and in my whole 2 months serving as Director of Trustee Strategies, it's been a wonderful experience to meet folks like Chairman Walker, who sits on our CAT executive board, and Charles Weaver, who also sits on that board as well. So I feel like I'm among friends and know many of the people here and have prior experience with the coordinating board, having served as a program director. So I feel like I've come full circle. That being said, I gravitated to this role for 3 reasons, and I want to be explicit about that because I hope that we can continue to cultivate a relationship with you all, particularly the presidents and CAT, those trustees and the association specifically. The association, as in my office, resides in the TACC office, and so we work obviously every day, every hour with TACC, Jacob specifically, and so whenever I have a question or he has a question, I want to be fully transparent in saying that we work our hardest, and I will work the hardest just to have alignment with our policy priorities. And I think that brings muscle to both associations in terms of the public policy priorities that will be coming out for the next session. That being said, our bread and butter is making sure that your trustees have the professional development that they need to make good decisions, to have good governance background, to have a strong sense of campus budget management. And in fact, I will be facilitating a session with two of the presidents, one of Galveston College, Miles Shelton, and then James Henry Russell from Texarkana College tomorrow. And so knowing that that's just an extension of the work that the association is doing within the state, but also just knowing that we're all about student success. That is why I think most trustees go into their position, because they feel a need to improve the campus from their position. And so working with the Texas Success Center, who has established a Board of Trustees Institute, is something that I'm very excited about, and I will share how we're moving with them towards, I think, a bigger and better annual conference for CAT. And then lastly, the policy advising piece, which I mentioned, having trustees, I think, is very important at the Capitol, along with our CEOs, our presidents, in an effort to, again, leverage the communication, leverage the relationships that we have with those members at the Capitol. And so I'll be working very closely with TACC. And as I'm not sure if Jacob mentioned, but we do have a joint policy development, or at least discussion, occurring in December, which will include our legislative committee from CAT, TACC, and also TCCTA, our Teachers Association. And so know that we're working lockstep as much as possible. I'll be brief in terms of the updates that I have in the 2 whole months that I've been here. We will have an annual conference, and what I'd like to say about that CAT annual conference, this is the first time, it's a very unique partnership that we're establishing with the Texas Success Center, where the Board of Trustees Institute, which used to be a separate opportunity for those colleges that were part of Achieving the Dream, we're now moving that to all our colleges. And so I think this is a big win for the state in terms of having trustees come together and share and elevate knowledge of how effective governance can contribute to student equity, success, and completion. We want to have opportunities to have trustee forums within that conference, so they can walk away with maybe an action that they can share with their presidents in terms of how they can help their presidents commit to a climate and expectations for institutional change that leads to comprehensive student success and a student success strategy, if there's not one already there. So we're all about helping the trustees move that forward. Our CAT president-elect, Bill Greenhill, has suggested, and we're very excited to say that the next conference will be in Fort Worth, he's part of Tarrant County County College, and he will be our host for that event. So I look forward to sharing more about that conference as it emerges, and we're finalizing the venue as we speak. I'm also happy to say that we will be taking a Texas delegation to the Association of Community College Trustees National Legislative Summit. And that is held every year in February, so we will be there in D.C. I invite you all to attend that event with your trustees if you're not a trustee. We will have a legislative breakfast that morning with some speakers to really identify, or not to identify, but to come forward with some bullets. So when we speak with our policymakers on the Capitol, we're singing one song, so to speak, and we have the information about Texas to share with those folks that really help make decisions at the federal level. I was interested to find out that we don't have any Texas U.S. senators or congressmen or congresswomen that serve on higher ed committees, but I think that also gives us an opening to share more about the state of Texas with those individuals. So that being said, I wanted to address Chairman Walker's comment about how we as CAT can help provide information about what this council is doing. And I would definitely say we are having a website that will come out in 2018. We're working on a new website, and I would be happy to have the link to these meetings set up there. But of course, email alerts are always important so they can listen in on these meetings as well. But I think that's vitally important, the work that you're doing, and I'm here to say I can assist in however way possible to ensure that whatever comes forward from this committee also includes some CAT input. Thank you.
I mean, there's great intersection. There's great intersection among the issues that this council will discuss, that TACC will discuss, that frankly our colleagues at TSTC and across the academy will be discussing. And so we will build multiple medium for communication, both externally going out into the field so that all of our members and all of our colleagues out there hear what the discussions are taking place, and then conversely, as a feedback loop to you, we will make sure that we provide you that context to you in a real-time way. I heard you earlier describe your intention to have deeper discussions on a smaller subset of issues. I think to the extent that we can work with you to make sure that we know what issues are being discussed over the next several quarters, that we will provide information that is relevant to that discussion in that quarter for you, that is field informed.
Any questions or comments concerning TACC or CAT? If nobody else will, I will. I'm sorry.
Not really concerns, comment. So, and you may have said this, and I just may have missed it. On the topics we just had on the 4 rulemaking, negotiated rulemaking areas, how does TACC weigh in, or how do you gather feedback, if at all, from all of the representative colleges to try to come a possible unified position, but a consensus feedback on those rulemaking processes?
Thank you, Mark. So several ways. Certainly when, in some instances, and I'll call out House Bill 2223 specifically, we worked with the coordinating board even before sort of there were draft recommendations out there. When the request for nominees for negotiated rulemakings took place, we made sure that our members were aware of the request for nominees. In some cases, we perhaps encouraged some members to recommend themselves. In other cases, we want to make sure that they understood that opportunity was there. Secondly, while we did not work with these negotiated rulemakings committees per se under this room as they were meeting, we certainly were in touch with members of those negotiated rulemakings so that we were cognizant of the kinds of discussions that were taking place. And then lastly, as a sort of standard issue for TACC, where there are areas of concern across many of our members, that we submit those recommendations through the formal process as well, through formal communications.
Any other comments or questions? Well, again, I would like to thank both of you. Those who've been involved with TACC and CAT will know that I don't think there's ever been a closer relationship than has developed these last 2 years. And when people speak at one of these meetings, you don't know if they're a trustee or a president. That wasn't always true. I can think it's kind of like the council here. We need to. We all have the same goal, and we're all on the same team, and leadership between Jacob and now Rose will certainly provide that impetus. So thank both of you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last session, as you know, we had a discussion on the baccalaureate degree programs, and that's Senate Bill 2118, and I think there have been some updates on some activities that has happened since the last meeting. And Rex, if you can give us that update, we would appreciate it.
So as many of you know, SB 2118 provided a mechanism for community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees in the areas of applied technology, applied science, early childhood education, and in a Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree. And so what we have been engaged in of late is the rule-making process for those to implement that particular piece of legislation, but also the development of the application for institutions to fill out to ask for a bachelor's degree. The rulemaking process has ended. I think yesterday was the last day for comments, and so we're looking at those. The rules themselves very much follow the legislation. If you've looked at Senate Bill 2118, if you haven't, I would encourage you to do so. Then you'll know that the bill itself is very specific. And so some legislation gives broad room sometimes for rulemaking. Other times the legislation is very narrowly drawn and there's not a whole lot of space for interpretation of the legislation. And this is one of those pieces of legislation that does not have a lot of space for interpretation. So it's a very specific bill. It provides, it basically has 3 parts to it. One of the pieces of it stipulates that community colleges seeking a bachelor's degree must meet all of the criteria that any other institution, in this case 4-year institutions who apply for a bachelor's degree, must meet. But it goes further than that. And it specifies that in those areas of the Bachelor of Applied Technology or Bachelor of Applied Science degree that there are other stipulations and criteria that need to be met that deal with regional workforce need, other criteria about the financial stability of the institution, other criteria about the financial or the value of the taxable valuation of your taxing district, and so forth. And then if you want to offer a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing, there is even further criteria associated with it that stipulate that you must meet the requirements for a licensure program in nursing, even if your program is a non-licensure program. And that's because what most community colleges, I suspect, will ask for will be what is often referred to as a transition program or a completer program, so that a student can go from an associate degree nursing program to a Bachelor of Science degree nursing program. And probably 99.9% of all students, upon achieving the ADN, the associate degree nursing program, they sit for the NCLEX exam and then become registered nurses. And so if you then get a Bachelor of Science degree as a transition or completion program, that does not involve their further licensure. So the Board of Nursing has not normally been involved in the approval of those kind of programs, but this legislation specifically calls for the Board of Nursing to be involved in that approval process. And so one of the things that we are still a bit in the process of working out with them is how their approval process will work and how it's going to dovetail with our approval process and exactly how the logistics of that is going to go forth. We've done had a lot of conversations with them about the kind of information that they will need. We have tried to set it up so that they're not asking, so that we're both not asking for the same information unless it's really necessary to both processes to do that. So we've tried to streamline that as much as we can, and the Board of Nursing has been very helpful and cooperative in this endeavor. We have a meeting with them next week or later this week to sort of finalize how this is going to go going forward with this. So the rules are out there. Most of the comments that we got about the rule pertain to the one piece where there is some room for interpretation, and it has to do with the provision that states, essentially states that your bachelor's degree program needs to be built off of a successful associate degree program. And what does successful mean? And in the original rules, in the interest of time and not having any further imagination, we put in there about meeting Perkins indicators. And most of the comments that we've received have revolved around the notion that Perkins indicators are, I don't know, it's hard to say. I think the idea is that they're too narrowly drawn. Although the indicators of success themselves that will probably wind up in there will be things like completion rates and graduation rates and that kind of stuff, all of which are included in Perkins indicators. But not all Perkins indicators are necessarily conducive to this. And so we recognize that. And so we're, in the next couple of days, we'll be analyzing those comments, and then we'll be coming back with some changes that that will reflect this notion of completion somehow. So that's the one place that we got comments where there's some room for interpretation. And as I mentioned, the rest of the bill itself is very specific. Once we get the rules finalized, and the plan is to take them to the December cause meeting, they will also go to the January board meeting, and then once those are finalized, then we can then finalize the application itself. We have one out on the web, and I know that there are institutions that are out there working on that application right now, because I've had several questions from several folks about it, and others on staff have as well. So we know that that's being worked on, and as soon as we can finalize the rules, then we can also finalize the application. We put all this out there telling people that please keep in mind that this may change some. If the rules change, then the application may have to change. So it may look slightly different, but hopefully whatever institutions have been working on, they'll be able to bring forward. And we'll work with the institutions to make sure that if there's any transition necessary, we can make that as easy as possible for you. And I think I'll leave it at that for the moment, and then try to answer any questions you might have about the process itself. Yes, sir. Well, as I said, the deadline for comments was yesterday, so we're going to take the rules to the December cause meeting, which is a committee of our board. And the way we operate typically is that the cause, which is the Committee on Academic and Workforce Success, reviews items and reject or deny, and then their recommendations then go to the full board. So they'll go to the December cause meeting. Then the full board will meet January 25th, I believe it is, and at the full board meeting, then hopefully those rules will pass. And then technically they take effect within 20 days after that passage, because they need to be posted in the Texas Register and so forth. Oh. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Rex, for a good presentation. I had a question about the program requirements, and in what you put down here, you followed pretty much what was in 2118, except for where they use the word consider. Under B, you use the words must be met. And the question there then goes to Carl Perkins, which deals with student placement, non-traditional participation, non-traditional completion. And I was wondering why the words must be met rather than consider, which is in the legislation. If you're going to add Carl Perkins, are these Carl Perkins standards criteria that are used for general academic institutions?
No, sir. And as I tried to point out, is the bill stipulates further criteria that are not applied to general academic institutions now. So part of what we have to deal with is statutory matter is to take the law as it is, and the law stipulates further criteria. And this is what I was talking about, building off of a successful Associate of Arts program. And so we have to have some definition of what it means to be successful, because the statute says that they have to be built off of a successful program. So how do we do that? And our first pass at it was to use these Perkins indicators for that. We don't really think that's a very good idea, which is why we're going to do something different.
Let me just, actually our first pass was a little different than what we sent out, and I just wanted to clarify. It came down to me, and when I reviewed them, it essentially said based upon success. And I thought, well, what in the world does that mean? How can anybody respond to that? And so Rex quickly came back with the Perkins, because we wanted something concrete for institutions to respond to. And I think it served its purpose well, because we've gotten some good feedback that we can lead to something that we can recommend that you actually know what it means and what to do with it. The original language was, it could have meant anything, frankly, at the language directly in the legislation. So that was the intent, and Rex turned that around in about half an hour, because we were concerned about getting the rules out there quickly so that you guys can then proceed. So I just want to take some responsibility for that in particular, getting there, because it is important that we get concrete feedback from you.
So you're still working on that piece to define success, and it may not include this Perkins going forward?
It probably won't.
Okay.
I mean, I will tell you that at the moment in the discussions that Gary and I have had about this is that we won't use Perkins. And frankly, I mean, I think Perkins is kind of interesting because if you look at the indicators, a lot of them really do a lot of them really do address the issue of what is a successful program in terms of completion and that kind of thing. But, and I think the one that vexes almost everybody, I mean, I see this every year when the reports come in, is particularly non-traditional, and how do you get, more males in nursing and more females into welding, and that's a simplified example of this, but non-traditional is interesting, and in fact, we may have, I know that we have at least one community college in Texas that I don't believe has ever met that particular Perkins indicator. So I think part of the concern with using Perkins indicators is that you may completely close the door based on that one small item to folks where that would not necessarily be wise or even the right thing to do. So we're probably just going to pull Perkins indicators altogether. Now, it doesn't mean we won't use things like completion and graduation rates and that kind of thing.
Rex, Gary, David, thank you for being responsive. Yeah, we appreciate it.
That would be the comment I would make. I know I've known you a long time, and you should know that I appreciate the getting of our attention and what that caused, but I appreciate more the flexibility that you're exhibiting in this. So I really appreciate the process here.
So I'm a little fuzzy on this, so bear with me, Nude. So thank you again for the flexibility on that one. You referred to whether the workforce needs were going to be met, whether there's a basis for a baccalaureate program. At least from our institution, there was some confusion about what's the case for that, and the statute says that we need to demonstrate that, but the rules seem to indicate that we may have to go further, that the existing facilities and resources can't be expanded to meet the workforce need. And that's really a question about what can higher ed do or not do, and whether we actually know enough to address that.
Well, part of what's built into this legislation that is not necessarily 100% clear, I think, is the idea that a bachelor's degree at a community college should only be approved in those instances where, and let me back up one step, and this is really true across the board when we look at program approval, by the way. So one of the biggest things we look at is the whole notion of workforce demand. And this is driven by the idea that when a student graduates from college, 2-year, 4-year certificate, associate's, bachelor's, master's, doctoral degree, that there's at least some reasonable chance that they will be able to get a job in that field that they've chosen. And so that's the idea behind looking at workforce demand. So there's two things sort of going on here. One is that for any institution that proposes a degree, we want to look at workforce demand, and is it there? Do they have that reasonable expectation that they can get a job in that field? And depending on what degree it is, for a bachelor's degrees, for example, then we will look at statewide demand. We may also look at regional demand. Master's degrees, that can be a mix of regional, statewide, maybe even nationwide. Certainly for doctoral programs, you might also look at what is the nationwide demand because they're competing in a little bit different market. One of the things that this legislation adds is this notion that we must also look at, or that we must look at regional demand. For the community college, then, while there may be a statewide demand for something, then is there also the requisite regional demand for it in the region that you serve? But the other piece of this is it goes to the other sort of huge criteria that we look at, and that is the unnecessary duplication or the non-duplication of programs, which really goes back to sort of what is the most efficient use of state resources. And in a sense, it also goes to the issue of what is the most efficient use of local resources as well. And so part of what we try to look at and try to make sure of is that we're not unnecessarily duplicating programs. And that's connected to the workforce demands, connected to student demand as well. And so part of this is to also make sure that if the community college is offering a bachelor's degree program, that the capacity for filling that workforce need doesn't already exist at the institutions that are around them. And in this case, that's primarily going to be four-year institutions. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But we often look at this. I'll give you one example. Last year, there was a program that a college in the Metroplex wanted to offer. There's a lot of four-year schools in the Metroplex. 3 of the other schools in the Metroplex all offered the same program. They all said, we're at capacity. We have no plans for expanding our capacity. The demand was there for more than what they were producing, so the program was approved. And so that piece of it is to try to get at that issue of whether the workforce demand is there, and then whether that demand can also be met by some other, or cannot be met by some other entity.
Okay, so just make sure I'm a little slower than the average bear. The idea of it, that does the workforce needs of the region, are they being met? And the answer could be say no, right? Then
sure.
There's the, could a four-year expand enough to potentially meet that need? And that becomes where it's a little bit more challenging. Could they? Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. It's their own resource allocation. And then what I think you just mentioned there is, do they have the plans to? Yeah. And I think for us, it's, how far do you need to go? Can you say that they don't, and from our understanding is they have no plans, versus sort of an evaluation of could they be expanded to meet those needs? And that sort of gets into a lot of other elements of what a four-year might be doing that we're not getting into.
Something directly about articulation, which they're using that word differently than we normally do. Yeah. Because it addresses that explicitly, I believe.
Yeah, and it's true that the idea in the legislation where you see this thing about articulation agreements is really designed to get at that issue. Because the four-year school to try to address your question, the four-year school can't just say, yeah, we want to do that, and so, sure, we're going to expand to meet the need. And part of the idea behind that articulation agreement is that they would have some proving up to do as well. Do they really want to do this? What is their timeline for it if they're going to do it? So that gets at this idea of the articulation agreement of whether the degree that you want to offer, can your students then go to a four-year school and get that same degree? Well, do they have the capacity? Well, it's not just a question of, well, yeah, sure, in 10 years from now we'll be able to do it or whatever, but they'll have to do some proving up on this as well. And to be quite frank about this is one of those things where we've never really done quite this before. And so the first couple of proposals we'll be working our way through a little bit on exactly how we approach that issue and what kind of evidence we're going to be looking for from both the 2- and the 4-year institutions. And so I think there'll probably be a lot of back and forth to work that out and find a medium ground, if you will, that works for everybody all the way around, that tries not to put an undue burden on anyone and also doesn't set some burden of proof that's impossible for anybody to meet, either at the 2 or the 4-year level. Yeah.
I think that was the concern, is that the 2 years have to prove that the 4 years won't meet it, or do the 4 years have to, if they're going to say that we can meet it, then they've got to give you evidence that they can, because certainly the workforce needs in some spaces are going to be pretty substantial.
And that's true, yes.
Yeah.
I might, and we talked about this briefly some weeks ago, so tell me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but my view of this is that, at least in terms of the applied science, many of the things that the community colleges will want to be offering will not be offered at universities. They will be very different in nature. So I think it comes down to maybe 2 or 3 degrees where it's likely to be primarily the issue. And if you go back to the original schools offering, for example, Brazosport with their process technology, they actually talked to the University of Houston and others, and they said, no, you guys are obviously the right people to do this. So I think when you look at things like that, it could become an issue in some unique cases, but I think it's more likely in an area where universities are explicitly offering the same degree. And well, frankly, probably nursing would be one of those where, and if you're in certain areas, there would be say Houston, there are a large number of schools offering a bachelor's of nursing. Whether they can expand, though, is a wholly different question. And so that may not be an issue there either.
Well, from an Austin perspective, that's probably our issue is nursing. Could they expand it? And then as you referred to, Rex, the idea of a transition program, a lot of ours will be ADN to bachelor's, which is not the traditional four-year model for nursing.
I should point out that much of what they would be adding would be things that are very much in the traditional model that you don't normally offer at the community college. So it's sort of a flipped process with a couple courses exception, I believe.
And, you know, in judging from the notifications that we've received so far from institutions who want to offer degrees, leaving aside nursing for a moment, to the best of my recollection, most of the rest of them really do sort of fall into that category that Dr. Gardner was just talking about, and those are things that four-year institutions are not necessarily doing now, and probably won't, because they're very specifically tied to particularly an associate of applied science program. And Brazosport really is, in a lot of ways, provides a sort of paradigm case of that, where you have a degree that was explicitly built off of a two-year program, and the other schools around there said, well, we don't need to be in that space. And so Brazosport's been very successful with it.
Really strong regional need, became a very important program in the area.
Yeah, and so I think that in a lot of ways, nursing will probably be as you point out, will probably be the primary focus of that.
So my question relates to this idea that we have a different definition of articulation. We've had articulation agreements for years with our local regional universities, and we need those to continue to provide at least what Bachelor of Science in Nursing we have. But we need more than that. We need 1,000 BSNs in our county alone about 2020 to meet the state and federal goals and so on. So we've had those, and we've interpreted that to mean, look, we have those. We already know that only 1 in 20 actually go and pursue that after they complete our RN degree. They finish their bachelor's. And so those pathways are there and they haven't been working. We've also provided notice to the other institutions and said, hey, we're planning on offering this. We've received no comment. And I'm gathering maybe there's additional documentation, evidence, et cetera, you're asking us to provide in addition to those into this new definition of articulation. Help me understand that a little bit more.
Well, yeah, and I think that, so using your case, and this is somewhat off the top of my head, so this may be revised a bit later on, but so I think additional information would be, so when was the last time that articulation agreement was revised or looked at? What does and this is something we would do in the normal course of looking at degrees anyway. And this is something that community colleges are not used to, because typically, if you want to do something in your own service area, then we've said fine, basically. And this is a little bit different because it puts you into sort of competition with other four-year degrees. So I think additional information would address the capacity issue. This may come out in the 50-mile notification, for example, and sometimes it does. But then this is also one of those places where, like in the example that I mentioned, we followed up with those programs and just, actually we had the institution follow up with those programs and just ask them, look, you offer these programs, where are you at? And they all said, well, we're all full and we have no plans of expanding anytime soon. And so an additional fourth program, given that the workforce demand was there, then made perfect sense. And so it was approved. So I think in that sense, that may be what we're looking for. And I can probably give you a better answer in a week. And I'll think through that some more, and we'll look at our application, and if we need to provide some more guidance and a little more thought about what that will look at, we'll give you that. So that you know what we're looking for.
So the follow-up is that it goes to the committee of the board, and so the revised rules that remove Perkins and those things will be available for public view before that discuss. Okay, so good.
Yes, Rex. Could you share, or do you know approximately of our colleges what percentage are pursuing or interested in pursuing these 4 programs that you mentioned, and to what extent? Do you know?
So far, I think we've had 6, maybe 7 planning notifications. Maybe slightly more than 10% of the 50 community colleges have indicated an interest and sent us a planning notification for a program. Some of those planning notifications are for multiple or more than one degree, but I think one institution has submitted a planning notification for 3 degrees, but most of them have been for 1. I think there may be a couple that have expressed an interest in 2 programs. So we have not received a single application yet. We've had, like I said, we've had a lot of calls about it. I've talked to, 3 or 4 or 5 institutions about what they need to do, what this is going to look like. But so far, the interest has been less than one might have thought. Now, once the other thing to keep in mind here is that outside of your 4, what we refer to as the legacy schools, which are South Texas, Midland, Brazosport, and Tyler Junior College, all the others also have to go through a level change with TACC. And so, I think a lot of them are also trying to figure out what do we need to do for this, and how do we get that lined up, and also lined up our application over here. And that's, if you've ever been through one of those, then that can be a lengthy and sometimes a costly process as well. So I think a lot of institutions are having some real soul searching, perhaps, or really thinking this through about, well, what do we want to do and when do we want to do it? And perhaps after the rules are finalized and the application is finalized and everything is really sort of out there in black and white, so to speak, then we may see more applications. But that's sort of where we're at right now. We've had about 6 institutions give us an official planning notification for degrees, and altogether there's probably, out of those 6, there may be a dozen or less programs attached to them. So.
Rex, is there a similar process for the universities who are doing downward expansion where there's already a community college?
A similar process for
a university to apply to do downward expansion where they were providing upper level classes in conjunction with a community college?
That's a legislative process.
So that's no.
Well, there is a process for it, but there's no process that they go through with the coordinating board for this, as far as I know.
Okay.
As far as I know, it's all strictly a legislative move. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments concerning baccalaureate degrees? It is 2:27 by that clock, which is almost halfway through. Is there a consensus as to whether we want to take a short break or keep on going? Hearing nothing, let's keep on going. And since Rex is on the hot seat, we'll just keep on going. And talk about a very short topic, dual credit.
Well, it's hard to know whether I enjoy talking about dual credit or baccalaureate degrees for community colleges more. They're my 1 and 2 most popular items these days. There's really not much to report about dual credit. At this point in time, as Jacob pointed out in the last legislative session, there was a lot of discussion about dual credit, but there was also a lot of asking of legislators to kind of put all that on hold and not do much of anything, if anything at all. And that came from a lot of different sectors that asked, sort of asked for a moratorium, if you will, on activity until some of the studies were conducted. And there are 2 of them underway, and Jacob alluded to both of them. One is the dual credit task force that was originally set up by the University of Texas system, and does include members from the coordinating board, the Texas Workforce Commission, TEA, all of the systems, 4-year systems are represented. TACC is also represented, and there are some community college representatives there as well. And that group will meet next in December and then possibly again in January to finalize some recommendations on areas such as transfer and funding, that kind of thing. And then the other major piece of this is the study that's being conducted under the auspices of the coordinating board with AIR, and to really look at dual credit in terms of completion and excess hours. There's a substantial piece on it in advising, for example, and some of your institutions may have been contacted to be a part of that. I think Kilgore was one of them that was contacted for sure, to try to participate in this look at how advising is conducted for dual credit students. You know, is it different? Is it the same? Is it better? Is it worse? Whatever the case may be. So that's a part of it. It's also conducting there's a cost study part of this that's designed hopefully to try to look at what does it actually cost for, in this case, for community colleges to offer dual credit and to provide it for students. There is a piece on rigor, and that draws a little bit of angst from folks, and I try to tell people that the idea behind the study is not to determine whether your courses have the appropriate rigor in them or not. It's try to determine whether your courses offered for dual credit have at least the same level of rigor that your regular college credit courses do, which is something that TACC asks of institutions on a regular basis, right? And so that's really the idea behind this. And so so some of your institutions will be asked to participate in this as well, in terms of submitting syllabi and course outlines and assignments and that kind of thing for some people to look at, and to take a look at both those in dual credit courses and regular college credit courses. You know, having done a lot of that in the past, and then I know that typically the syllabi all are the same. So it's not clear how much we'll find out from this, but that also is a piece of the study as well. So what we're hoping is that, well, and one other piece of this I'll mention is there's often discussion about what the sweet spot for dual credit is. And so we know that, for example, that a student who accumulates 80 hours of dual credit has probably taken way too much, because they're not, as Dr. Serrato pointed out earlier, they're not ever going to be able to apply all of that to a degree, highly unlikely at least. But, you know, but 6 may not be enough. And so is there some kind of level in there where it's sort of the optimal level for students taking dual credit? Some of the discussions we've had revolve around the idea that, well, there might be, but it may also vary by student as well, and what the student wants to do later. And so, but the study is going to try to look at some of those issues as well, and look at part of this idea of excess hours. What we do know with our studies of transfer so far is that students with dual credit tend to have excess hours of about 6 more than students who take no dual credit do, and these are students who graduated with a bachelor's degree. Okay, so it's about 15 excess hours for students, and these are courses that they got an A, B, or C in, by the way. So it's about 15 for students with no dual credit. It's 21 for students with dual credit. So what is that? So what is that sweet spot, for lack of a better way to put it? So the study will try to get at some of that. You know, part of what we don't know yet is how successful it will be at that, and I suspect that, like a lot of studies, this may produce more questions than it does answers. But we hope it'll also provide us with direction for where we need to do some further research and further study on the whole issue of dual credit, and in the long run, of course, what's really in the best interest of the students that we serve.
There's some things that may not come out in the report that have been interesting in terms of things that may seem to work very well at one institution that might be worth sharing with another in terms of how to make it work better. And so that I don't think there will be enough evidence to make that a part of the formal report, but I think it's something that we will want to look at to see if it's worth sharing, because there are more differences than I would have thought in terms of the approach. I'll say on our part, I just want to reiterate that the commissioner has said that we think dual credit's important, and we want to make sure it continues to work as it's expanding. And so we want to make sure that that same level of success we have now continues. As as all of you know, as you expand, who's going to teach those courses? If it's more and more high school teachers, how do we make sure they bring the same concept, even though they're using the same syllabus to the table that your own faculty would have if they're doing that? And we know for those of us who have taught, you know that part of what you know is who you've taught. And if you've taught mainly high school students, you could teach a class more rigorously, and it still may not be at the, if it's a high school teacher, the rigor your faculty may teach it. So how do we help them do that? So part of it is not to say, don't do it, but how do we make sure that the good things we're getting out of it remain in place? One other thing to add along with the hours is, going back to comment made earlier, the more hours you get, the bigger issues there are in terms of transfer. At your institution, students are required to have a degree plan in place after 30 hours. You have so many students in high schools accumulating more than that now, as they really had the kind of conversation they need to in terms of, well, I'm considering 3 different majors. This is a course that will fit for all 3 different majors versus this one that will only fit for 1. And that's a difficult enough conversation on your own campus. So these are things that we hope to tease out, and I think we may find, even though it's not a direct part of the study, some people who seem to have at least an answer that might be worth sharing with someone else, perhaps not. So.
When we hear about rigor, a lot of times it's in reference to the community colleges and what kind of rigor they're providing. But my question is, are we also looking at that with regards to the universities that are getting into the dual credit mission? A lot of times we hear from some of our colleagues that a lot of TAs are being used in the dual credit mission with maybe a faculty member from the university as the faculty member of record, but not the person doing the delivery.
I believe that the sampling protocol that's been developed for this is only with community colleges. However, I think this is another one of those areas where at the end of this we may need to say, well, and here's the next thing, we also need to look at this, because I agree with you. There is 4-year schools have entered into this space more and more. They're still 90% or better of all dual credit is still offered by community colleges, but there are more and more 4-year schools involved in it all the time. And I think the kinds of questions that you ask about advising and rigor and all of that is it should be and ought to be applicable to any institution if they're offering it. And so that may be one of those places where we need to then, frankly, seek some more funding and then also look at that as well and go, well, these are the parts of this that we didn't get to because we didn't have the ability to, but now what do we need to pursue at the next level?
I would think a little differently. I don't know that we'd need another study. If we found things that would say, we might, but these are things that we need to be sure about in terms of rigor that we would insist they apply to anybody offering dual credit, whether they're community colleges or universities. Now, if somebody were to argue with us on that, then maybe we might have to do a study, but I think I'm assuming the issues are the same. Who's teaching the course? As you mentioned, how are they applying it? Do they really understand what rigor would be? Where I think the faculty at the institutions understand that very well. It's just when you're needing to employ other folks, and to expand dual credit much, it almost has to be with more and more high school teachers, simply because, and many schools that are in parts of the state don't have the advantage that community colleges do in an area like Austin or Houston, where you've got a population where you can draw very qualified adjunct faculty to supplement what you're doing. If you're in rural areas, you don't have that as much of that. You have some of it, but so I'm glad you brought that up. But my assumption has always been that we would insist on, if we have anything that we say here's something that needs to be done that hasn't been done, we would require that of everyone.
Yeah, Just a couple of comments. I certainly agree, and we always need to remember when we're referencing high school teachers, they're teachers that have a master's degree plus the 18th in the field as per our accrediting body's requirements and best practices. I'd be really interested in the study that's looking with AIR. I forgot about the AIR study, the RAND study. There's lots of studies going on.
They're the same.
Oh, RAND and AIR is the same. Okay,
Yeah.
good. I wasn't sure. But the 6 hours, in particular with A, Bs, and Cs, again, that's just a waste of credit. And we need to identify if they took the 6 hours, and if there's a way to identify if they retook those courses because they were advised to do so at the university. My alma mater, when I was at South Texas, we had to tell students, don't take this if you're going to transfer there, because they're going to make you retake this, whether you have an A or not. So I think that that's something that we really need to look at and ensure that if those additional 6 hours, where we're saying these dual credit students have 21 excess hours that received a baccalaureate versus 15 for the student that didn't have dual credit, if it's an advisement issue, then we have a larger issue that we need to make sure that we address through the CB. I mean, I know there's ways to do that. With regards to studies, I don't know if the CB has seen the preliminary results from former State Representative Mike Villarreal's study. I mean, he looked at 3.2 million dual credit students. It is a robust and rich study, and the findings are remarkable. I know that he's getting ready to publish it, but this is another piece where I don't know of any study that's looked at 3.2 million dual credit students in our state. And matriculation, completion, and some, again, incredible findings and recommendations for state policymakers.
William, what were you citing there? Whose study?
Former State Representative Mike Villarreal from San Antonio is finishing up his dissertation at UT Austin. And he and at the Marshall Center, his research fellows did a study in which they looked at dual credit students in a very unique way, dual credit students versus traditional students at the same high school, those who didn't have dual credit, those who did. This, to me, eliminates all other items. When we talk about a dual credit student that goes to UT Austin versus a traditional student that doesn't have any dual credit at UT Austin, we're still looking at top 6%. It's a little different than if you're looking at students from the same high school, essentially the same background, same neighborhoods. But he studied 3.2 million dual credit students.
I'm going to have to call a quick audible, and let's keep on talking about this, but we're going to have to shift to item number 9. Julie Eklund is going to be a presenter, and she has a previously scheduled very important meeting beginning at 3. So let's hear her, and then we can jump back to dual credit, because I know there are probably some more questions and comments.
Thank you. I appreciate you adjusting for my schedule today. I am going to share with you some information about our revised accountability measures and revised accountability system interface. And since a few of you I know are new to this body, I also wanted to show you our 60by30text.com website, because it's a great leaping off point to our accountability system, and also includes a lot of important data related to our 60by30 text plan. And Jenna Cullinane-Heggie, who is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner in Strategic Planning and Funding, is going to be driving for us. And then if I do have to leave, she'll be able to answer any questions and take over for me from there. Of course, you're all familiar with our plan. With the introduction of the plan, we started looking carefully at our accountability system, not only the measures themselves, but also our interface. It was getting pretty dated and old and didn't have the type of modern functionality that we knew was possible. And so we went ahead and hired a contractor to work with us to revise the interface, the web presence for our accountability system. system, and we also worked with our accountability groups from our community colleges, our universities, and our health-related institutions to take a look at our accountability measures and revise them to fit more closely with the plan, as well as to pare them down a little bit, because we really had more than I think were appropriate. We really wanted to focus on what was most important. So first, I want to just mention again, 60by30text.com is a website that has been generously funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They made it possible to put together this site. I think it's very user-friendly for a variety of stakeholders. That's really been the point of this website, is to reach a broad audience. We have a variety of topics, and we do update them regularly. There are infographics. In fact, I've seen some of these that have been pulled directly from this site and used in articles and for other media purposes and in PowerPoints by folks around the state. It's interactive. It has statewide data. It also focuses on regional data, and Jen is going to be talking a little bit about some regional efforts we have going on with the plan. And you're able to jump in and look at institutional metrics around the plan, so you can select your institution or any and actually see where that institution stands, again, around the goals and targets of the plan. The accountability system provides additional measures beyond the plan, but also includes plan measures, which you'll see in a moment. So we can go now to 60by30text.com because it's an easy thing to find, and I want to show you how to go from there to the accountability system. We've got 60by30text.com, 60by30text.net, 60by30text.org. So if you can remember 60by30text, which I think everyone in the state now has become familiar with our plan, you can get not only to this website, but also to the More Data button that's up on the right-hand corner, where we're able to show you, where you're able to easily access the accountability system and all the additional data that's there. One thing I did want to share with you today, because we think it's kind of special, is something that staff developed related to our educated population goal, which is our goal that 60% of the young adult population, 25 to 34, will have a post-secondary degree or certificate by 2030. So we had staff that created what is called a dot density map, and they were able to get information from the Census Bureau by census tract, so very small areas, and actually map out who in the population has an associate degree or higher. And actually, it's the way they've done it is it shows it by graduate degrees, bachelor's degrees or higher, associate degree, certificate, or some college, and then by high school diploma or less. We aren't able to show certificate holders alone because that's not data that is collected by the Census Bureau, but it is included in that some college category. And it's actually a fascinating thing to play with. So I wanted to make you aware of it. We've had institutions have been very interested to see this because you can really zoom in and see for very specific neighborhoods and areas what it looks like in terms of the background of the population there. It's just for those 25 to 34-year-olds, which I think is very helpful. You can see when Jenna zoomed in, each dot was at 10 people, represented 10 people. As you zoom out, you see it's more people. And you can filter. So you could look at, for example, just those folks who had a certificate or less and think about, well, where could we hone in? Are there certain areas where we see a lot of people who maybe have started college and haven't completed? So it's really, I think, a valuable tool, and I wanted you to know it was there and to encourage you to use it. And then moving on, let's jump in, actually let's jump back to the PowerPoint, and I just want to talk a little bit more about the accountability system, and then we'll do a short demo on that for you. Okay, so the accountability system has several interrelated purposes. But I think what was important for us is to make sure that we updated it for our new plan, and to really look carefully at the measures, because one purpose is really for institutions, it's really to keep the state focused on what's most important, and if you have too many measures, it's hard to do that. So we really, in addition to including the goals and the targets that are in the plan, we really thought about which measures are going to be most important for supporting those. It has key measures and contextual measures, and I did give everyone a handout, and you'll need your reading glasses for this, but of course all this information is available in the system, so you don't need to use this, but I thought it might be a handy way to see that these on both sides are our measures for our community colleges and our two-year state schools and TSTCs, and they are organized by key measures and contextual measures. And this includes the methodology. All of this detail, again, is in the accountability system, so you can go in and look at any measure, hover over it, and see how we calculated that measure. As you'll see for the key measures, many are directly related to the plan or in terms of plan goals and targets, but we also include things like graduation rates and enrollments, which of course have been important for us to provide for our institutions. Okay, and then I'm just going to have Jenna jump in, and we'll show you a couple of things in the system. Jenna, if you could go to community colleges, and we actually, for our system now, we break out, you can either look at all two-year colleges together, or you can look at community colleges or our state colleges. So I think that's very, very helpful, depending on what you want to compare. Jenna's going into completion. We've been able to add some filters to the system. So, for example, these are degrees and certificates awarded statewide for our community colleges, and Jenna can show you by using the blue filters across the bottom. You could, for example, just look at female Hispanic students and see what our numbers look like in terms of that population. And again, there's a lot of, and it's not showing here, but you could see it if you go online. I think it's showing a little bit there. Those buttons are available for any population. We've, of course, had to follow FERPA requirements, so there's some data that we haven't been able to show as at high a level of detail. But whenever possible, we've tried to provide detail and make it easy for you to use. So that's available. If you look under resources, we have created a quick start guide, so if you have an opportunity, you want to go in and see what's there, it's a great way to get some background on how to use the system. All the measures and definitions are also listed there, so you can open that up and see a list of the different measures if you want to check and see if something is available to you. In terms of the peer groups, we have information about which colleges fall into what peer groups. For the community colleges, it's done by size alone, so we have very large colleges, medium colleges, and small colleges, and colleges will contact us if their populations have changed and they're interested in moving to a different peer group. We bring our accountability groups together once or twice a year, and Jenna's going to be talking a little bit about some regional target work that they're going to be doing this spring when she presents later in the agenda. And then finally, on the upper right-hand side, you will see an interactive button, and this is for those data geeks or data gurus, I guess I could say, who want to take a deeper dive. There's the possibility to create a wide range of reports, and this will include data that isn't part of our accountability measures, but we think will be important for institutions to have for comparative purposes. For example, you can go in there and find program level data. So if you're interested in how many students are completing programs in different degree areas at different institutions, it's very easy to jump in and find that detail. And again, there are instructions in the startup guide for using that. So we wanted to make you aware, again, not only that the measures have been updated and revised to align with the new state plan, but also that we have this new interactive resource that I believe is a little more user-friendly and certainly has a higher level of detail than what we've been able to provide in the past related to Texas higher education data. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
You can make your meeting.
Well, thank you all very much.
I think we can jump back to dual credit because there might have been some other questions or comments that people had concerning that issue.
I had an additional question. We'd been advised that there was the possibility of the coordinating board actually in conversation with TEA in terms of parameters for dual credit, possibly along the lines of field of study.
Yes, there was legislation that directed the coordinating board and TEA working together to develop goals and objectives for dual credit. And we have had a couple of conversations with with TEA about this, and those are still in the very early draft form. Right now, we're sort of looking at 5 or 6 goals really that are rather broad in nature. The one piece of the legislation to pay some attention to is that it does say then that those goals should be established with the idea of an evaluation system at some point in mind too. So we're trying to be very careful about what we do with goals. And of course, since this is the result of legislation, then this will be put into rules somewhere and will be widely distributed, and hopefully we'll get some comments back from that. But we're still in the very early stages of that, and so there's still an awful lot of internal vetting we need to do before we go out with it. But we'll make sure that everybody gets it, and probably at this next meeting we can bring those back to you. We'll have a much better idea what they're going to look like.
Can I make a comment just in terms of dual credit and the phrase? Because right now, about 10% of dual credit is CTE dual credit. And we've talked a lot internally, and we need to begin to distinguish between CTE dual credit and what we're typically talking about, because CTE is going to expand. The rules are different. What you can do with it is different. And it's important for the parents and students to understand they're both valuable, but to different ends, and you can't do exactly the same thing. And I've just noted anecdotally around Austin the number of parents who, if their dual credit's available, take it without other stuff in mind. So I think, in terms of earlier remarks, I think part of it could be whether universities are accepting it. Part of it could be whether students are just taking it when it doesn't make sense. It's probably going to be rare that you'll find a high school student that's saying, I want to be a geologist. But if they want to be a geologist, they can take biology, and it will count in their core curriculum. But they could have taken, if dual credit geology were available, which I don't think ever is, that would have fit in the core, which saves them 3 hours. So there are these nuances that make it really difficult. But I think part of this is a communication with people who we want to take advantage. So it's not just getting our own mechanisms fixed, but make sure that parents and students understand that it's all valuable, but you may not be going in a direction that it has the same value, and you may still want to take it, but you need to understand that. And that's, I think, a challenge we need to not forget.
And Dr. Serrata mentioned this idea about retakes. In the first part of the study, the RAND, and I've been admonished not to call it AIR, it's AIR, but you know, don't make it spell AIR if you don't, but anyway. But when you looked at that issue of retakes.
Association for Institutional Research is why they don't want to do that.
I know, yes, I know. And I get that. So, I mean, but we looked at that issue of retakes, and, you know, the hypothesis going in was that there would be a lot of it. Turns out there's very little by comparison. So it's kind of an interesting finding. And one of those things where you look at that and you go, well, okay, so if that's not what's going on, then what is going on? And we'll take a little closer look at that, and I think the final report then will probably flesh that out some. But it's an interesting question, and I certainly would have expected the percentages to be much higher than they were.
You know, I glanced over the interim report, which is on your website from RAND, and one of the last items, or to be considered, was kind of a vague reference to funding that. The state funds both high school, which means I think if somebody's taking a dual credit course, they still get to, you know, they're funded for that, even though the student isn't sitting in that high school seat. And I guess we get our 17 or 18% from the state for state funding. I don't know. I'm just a little concerned that, and please feel free to eliminate this concern, that in the next session or two, there may be some mandates that come down that may fit an urban area but not fit a rural area. And one of them may be funding. I know that there's some colleges, community colleges, that don't charge for dual credit. Others charge full amounts. I know in the rural and small colleges it would be a burden, if not a disaster, if we all of a sudden gotten a mandate saying you shall give dual credit for free. So I think some attention needs to be paid to that, and whether RAN is specifically addressing that or not, I don't know. But and there are very other issues. The teachers of that sort. I hate to use an expression like one shoe doesn't fit all, but that's the case here. I think we're very varied institutions around the state, and we're just concerned about mandate that may meet an urban area but not a rural, or a rural and not an urban. And so it's a very general question, and I don't know if it would be worthwhile to have some of the RAND people come and discuss if they're going into that area or not, so, or the various areas.
The piece that the AIR study is looking at is the cost part of it. I don't believe that they're going to look very much at the funding end of it at all, correct? Yeah, they're not going to look at the funding.
They're really going to
piece of
look
it.
at what it's costing people to deliver. And
Right.
that's a challenge in and of itself. But I think because we do have rural and urban involved in the same study, we may see differences, but it may help in regard to the question you raised, but it's hard to know until that they get at it. And but it is interesting. One of the things that the association provided at one of these meetings that that the UT system has on dual credit was some breakdowns in terms of who was charging tuition, who wasn't. But also I thought it was interesting. There's some institutions that are charging for some dual credit, but not for other, based on subject. It's a very small number, but I had not heard that before. So there are different approaches. I think more people are taking one approach than another, but I don't think, at least at this point, they're not collecting anything that would weigh in on the state should use one single model. I think it's just trying to understand what are, trying to get it as close as I can to real costs for delivery. And because I don't think anybody's explicitly addressed that before, at least not in Texas.
Chairman Walker, I want to share with the group that in the early formulation of this group, it was thought that members of this committee should be involved with the Formula Advisory Committee. And so I and Mr. Reeser have the distinct honor of serving on that committee, and we have the pleasure of coming back next week with the recommendations. And we were asked to specifically look at dual credit funding for community colleges and TSTC, and you can speak to that if you want to, Mike. But right now, we did look at the RAND study and ask if there was more information that we could base a decision to make any recommendations on. We felt like the goals need to be set out first, and there wasn't really much information in way of research that would direct us, what it actually is costing us. And the cost issue is a costing now, but it might actually cost more to expand beyond what we're doing, and so that gets even more complicated. So I think you'll see, I don't want to speak for that committee, but on the community college front, I think you'll see us say, please fund us in this upcoming session based on contact hour reimbursement for dual credit as you have in the past. Now, will that hold? I don't know, and what happens the next session, who knows, but just share that a subcommittee looked at that in depth and really tried to run at this, hey, is there anything out here we can hang our hat on? And we hadn't. And the reason I'm sharing the part about Formula Advisory and members from this group is I'm soon to be a former member of this group, so I want you to be thinking about that as you go forward.
I'd like to comment about, in our situation, many colleges that are large, like Laredo, it is a detriment to us. We're concerned about it, the dual. Although our overall matriculation has increased, but has been at the cost of the paying of the full-time academic students. So the overall, the bottom line, it actually has not helped us. We're way up with the dual, and the high schools expect us not to charge them. So we have to do it, because if we don't do it, somebody else will take them. And we know, yes, we do get the state to reimburse us, but overall, it is not a very great situation for us when it comes to the bottom line. And so that's a concern that we have, although we are growing, but our overall paying students has decreased. So I think that's a dilemma that many probably colleges are facing, like we are as well.
I think that's a really, really important point, and you guys are the only ones who could really weigh in, is that this is just one of the important services you provide to students in the state. You have other students as well. How does it all fit in? You know, how far can you go with the resources you have? And then at some level, you know, miracle cures still cost something. You know, and so I think you can go so far with the resources you have, but it may be to go further, maintain the rigor and the delivery. There's additional costs. I was going to say real costs, but there's real costs already. And you're the ones who understand that the best. And I think we could use some guidance on that as well, through the formula committees and elsewhere.
Well, I'd love the minister to reflect that you said that dual credit's a miracle cure. No, but it does have a lot of positive benefits, and we know what those are, but we do know the challenges of what it looks like in the future.
I was just trying to emphasize, sometimes we oversell good things, and there really is no miracle cure, but there's good here. And how do you maintain the good? And sometimes in thinking it is a miracle cure, the good starts diminishing. And it may be small amounts, but suddenly it will catch up with you. And I think that's part of what you're talking about.
You mentioned the rigor, and as I track that down, it usually lands in the transfer issue. Talking about rigor, we just had our, a week and a half ago, right before Thanksgiving, we had a TACC visit on dual credit. And they left with no recommendations, and it mentioned they're impressed with the rigor at our campus and what's happening there in those situations. But where I'm going with this is I wonder if the recommendations on limitations of dual credit courses under Senate Bill 1091, the applicability to that about, is that just for those programs at that institution? So if it's a program at Grayson College, and you brought up the field of study. So if we do have a field of study, but I don't offer that program, but the student in a dual credit may not come to me right after. They may go straight to university. And so it seems if we want to put students in a pathway, in a transfer pathway, it might be appropriate to offer classes that I don't have in programs at my location that fit into a field of study, or they give some flexibility to say, there is applicability at where that student wants to go. They're going to UT Austin. This is a class that applies there. We'll let them do it at our location, et cetera. So it's just a question, and I know that's in public comment phase, but not all the time is that student coming to us right after high school graduation. They're going somewhere else. And we've got to focus on putting students in pathways so we don't have them at 6 hours more than what they need, because it is an advising issue. And again, when I track rigor down, I always wind up in transferability, you know, so. Has that been thought about in 1091 or?
Yeah, it was discussed. You know, by and large, the position, particularly from TEA, was that it should be restricted to programs already approved, because that's the early college high school model. I mean, let's face it, in early college high school, you're supposed to be offering programs. And so it's sort of an outgrowth of that model, this other piece. And granted, this may be something that, particularly as we further develop fields of study, this may be one of those places where we need to come back and revisit the rules that we've adopted to make sure that they're actually working and that they're actually serving students the best we can. Because you really raise an interesting point about it.
I am heavily involved in developing pathways and focusing on transfer, and I'd rather not wait much longer than we need to. If we could really start thinking about that in the negotiated rulemaking process, I think it would be really beneficial for students and for the state.
The next item for discussion is developmental education reform, and Mr. Gerald Booker is going to know. Maybe not. I just did let them know. You do not look like Mr. Booker.
So as you can see, Jarrell is not here. I am sitting in for him. He was detained, unfortunately, but I think I can cover the material here on the agenda. I hope so. Well enough. We were just going to give you a brief update on the progression of House Bill 2223, specifically the rules that staff have worked to put together. They were posted on October 20th, and the comments period closed on November 20th. We'll be taking the proposed rules to the December cause and ultimately to the January board meeting for approval. We have received a number of comments. Staff are in the process of reviewing those comments. I can tell you in general what we're seeing. Most of the comments we've reviewed are seeking clarity or are asking for or asking questions about how to implement co-requisite models in particular circumstances, say in the summer or during mini-mesters, which are typically 3-week sessions between the long term or just following a long term. Since these are specifically about implementation strategies, we've not addressed that in the rules. The rules are very cohere pretty directly to statute, but we will be working on developing an FAQ, as well as working with partners at TACC, as well as Dana Center and other interested stakeholders along. Certainly with you all, many of your colleges have been very involved in developing co-requisite models and experimenting with different structures. A few of the comments also sort of go beyond the scope of the rules or touch on elements that are not within the coordinating board authority to make rules on. Those are generally elements that the colleges or the universities retain authority to decide, such as which specific courses or interventions should be used in developmental education, or which credit-bearing courses are allowed to be used for co-requisite models. So certainly those kinds of decisions are really left up to the colleges and the universities. It would obviously be inappropriate for the coordinating board to be stipulating that. We will be, once the comments have been summarized and responses completed, those, as well as I think I can already see so far that there are a couple of comments regarding clarity of language where we might change a word or two here or there. But we will bring all of the summary of comments and our responses in the materials that are submitted to cause in December, and then ultimately in the board in January. So I should say, since it looks like a lot of the questions we're getting are things that we'll need to address in either guidance letters or more likely actually through professional development opportunities. Those, we are already working with Texas State as an organizer of technical assistance and professional development to help us put on a couple of professional development meetings in 2 different places in the state. I think we actually have a couple of community colleges who have stepped up to host. And those we will start in the spring. I'm aware as well that TACC is looking to put together some trainings, as well as I believe Dana Center and CCA, and we're trying not to overlap either in dates or content too much, so it can be most useful. Certainly we'll be reaching out to many of you and your staff to help us with some of the content of those professional development. So that's really all I have for you. Do you have any questions? No? Well, thank you. I know. Thank you so much.
I do have one question.
Yeah, sure.
As on the Formula Advisory Committee, there's some concern about the decrease of contact hours as it impacts our reimbursement. We're still needing to do this work, and I know that we've had some things shared with us there, but do you have any thoughts about fast forwarding? What does that look like, and how might that inform a revision to the formula going forward, not this immediate next session, but or maybe the success formula and those sort of things? Has he given any thought to that?
Well, I'm going to use one of those phrases that I always hate to hear, which I think that's beyond my pay grade. Oh. However, I will say I think that's a reasonable question. The first thing we're looking at, of course, is that while it is typically utilized for fewer contact hours, the NCBOs are eligible for funding. So they can be reported for funding purposes, and that NCBOs can also be expanded to as much as, at least in the semester credit hour structure, up to 3 semester credit hours. So there is flexibility there in the how many contact hours and so on, and they can be reported for funding. That doesn't totally answer your question, certainly, but it is one aspect that I think many colleges to date who are using NCBOs have not been reporting them per se, because that's been an option. There hasn't been the requirement to do so. So it's something that we're making sure that we bring up as often as possible so folks know that that is an option. That doesn't completely answer your question, but I will make note of it, and this, we would obviously have to work with legislature and staff here to think about how that might be addressed.
Other than NCBO standing for non-course-based option, I don't really know anything else. So that might be something we get a little background on, not necessarily today, but just to learn a little bit about that.
I can give you a very brief description and certainly put off to a later time more in-depth description. But usually I describe an NCBO as a delivery and funding mechanism for DevEd, which is a very short way of saying it. But the main thing that an NCBO allows is a flexibility in the DevEd intervention. So it can be something as, I think, as few as 4 hours of, say, tutoring, or it could be expanded into something consistently, a consistently offered supplemental instruction throughout the semester, or it could be up to, let's say, 2 semester credit hours of that's offered within, say, the first 8 weeks of instruction. That would be additional instruction. I mean, there are multiple different models. It could be a boot camp, for instance. So it becomes a way of creating different delivery mechanisms, as well as a way to submit those kinds of models for funding. So if that helps. Mm-hmm.
If there are no further questions, thank you very much. We'll move on to something that's all around us, which is regional targets for 60 by 30 TX. And Jenna Cullinane-Hagee will make that presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jenna Cullinane-Hagee. I'm the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding. I believe that we did a little overview of this the last time I was here, but it was the lightning round version. We had about 3 minutes at the end of the meeting, so I just sped right through it. So today is an opportunity for folks who are new or for folks who got the lightning round to spend a few more minutes talking about what this regional target strategy is all about and give you some updates on where we are in terms of progress. I was thinking today, as I was listening to the other presentations that came before me, about something I read this morning. So Jeff Salingo, who's going to be one of the featured speakers at the leadership conference in the coming days, he wrote a piece about Portland State University, and he was talking with the vice provost for innovation, and he was saying that to survive, institutions need to be ambidextrous in terms of thinking about both short-term and long-term issues at the same time, flexibly going back and forth. So I think some of the things that immediately preceded me were some of those immediate short-term things. But what we're going to shift to now is maybe something that is pushing us to think a little bit longer term. So I hope will still be of interest, even if it's not something you're going to work on tomorrow. Hopefully it's part of that longer-term strategic planning that you're doing within your institution. Okay, so the regional target approach is something that we have developed in the last several months to really think about how to push 60 by 30 TACC forward. We've heard a lot of support for the plan overall. People say these are the right kinds of goals. We want to be thinking about completion. We want to be thinking about marketable skills. We want to be thinking about student debt. But when we think about that big 60% goal, we're at 41% right now. How are we going to get there? What do we need to do? Who needs to come to the table? And we recognize that the agency by itself is certainly not going to get there. We need all of you, your partnership. We need folks from K-12. We need folks from business and industry to really develop jobs that demand a higher level of education, good opportunities to make a livable wage. So part of this is thinking about how do we mobilize a set of stakeholders to broadly come to the table around 60 by 30 TACC. We also have been thinking regionally because we know that regions have and institutions within them really differ in important ways. But we know despite those differences, the vast majority of students are staying within region when they go into higher education. On average, 80% of Texas students stay in region. So we've got the flagship. Certainly there's mobility across regions, but in every region it is true that the majority of students stay put. We also find that's true in transfer patterns. The vast majority are moving, but they're moving within those areas. And we also know the institutions are most closely linked to their local labor markets, and that connection is really important. We also think that institutional target setting, as we are asking institutions to help play a role and move us towards our goals and targets, that institutional target setting will be improved if you're thinking beyond your own institution. For example, if you're going to grow your enrollment, but all you've done is taken the enrollment from the institution next to you, we haven't raised all boats as a state, so we really need to be thinking a little bit more broadly. And we also want to provide kind of that nudge to get to more tactical planning beyond this kind of very big goal. How do we move into kind of the operationalization around it? So the scope of this work is, again, we've got our 10 higher education regions, and we have developed preliminary targets in 3 areas. So one is the big 60 by 30 TACC goal, the educated population goal. The second is the completion goal of 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelors, and masters. And the third is actually a target under the completion goal, which is to reach 65% of recent high school grads moving directly into higher education the following fall after they graduate high school. We've picked these because they are most amenable to kind of a regional focus, and they're ones we get a lot of questions about. The student debt goals, marketable skills goals are also very important, but they lend themselves more easily to kind of institutional work, and it's more kind of readily apparent where institutions will play into those. We will then ask regions to do 2 things. One is to identify at least one powerful strategy in each of these 3 areas. And then the second is to actually identify numeric targets under the completion goal by institution. So we know this work will not be without challenge. In fact, we're going to work through them, but we are very aware that ensuring cooperation and broad participation in some areas is going to be tricky. Folks maybe see each other as competitors in places. Institutions are maybe not accustomed to working together in particular areas. And we don't naturally have an infrastructure that maintains these 10 regions. I think some institutions maybe don't know which region they're in, but we're gonna work through those things. And these are surmountable challenges. But I think that there is a really strong understanding that we have a shared responsibility for students and that we can do this kind of collaborative work. So we hope, ideally, that we're balancing state priorities, institutional priorities by hitting this kind of regional focus. We want kind of local ownership, local creativity, but also a sharp focus on state priorities. And we think that we kind of hit that right mix. We also think that this will be a great opportunity to think about the right mix of degrees, for example, under the completion goal. In your region, do you need a lot of certificates and associates? Do you need more masters and bachelors? And we really think that should be a local conversation, not something that the coordinating board would know from our perspective here. So where we are in this timeline, the board approved the process at the October board meeting, and we have started piloting this work with one region, and we're starting with the South Texas region. So I know a couple of folks here are from the South Texas region. And we did a kickoff webinar about 2 weeks ago, and I'll give you a little update on that in a few minutes. But then all of the other regions are going to start after the first of the year. So right now, this is just kind of a heads up. It's coming. You'll find out more information. Presidents and liaisons will get direct notification about what's going to happen starting in January. But we're doing some additional prep right now. We did a data fellows training where we brought community and technical college folks one day, university folks another day, where we did a deep dive on regional data so that they're really well informed about the goals, the targets, and the data that support them by institution and by region. So you'll have folks that are assets kind of on the ground within every region. We're also developing a starter kit that provides a lot of that data, provides some guidance for how to collaborate, and offers some suggestions for your work together. Also provides some suggested strategies, not exhaustive, not directive, just illustrative to start from. We'll be doing those kickoff webinars that I mentioned in the other 9 regions after the first of the year, January, February-ish. We'll also be using the accountability meetings this year in a new way. What we want to do, we've previously brought the 2-year institutions together one day, 4-year institutions another day, HRIs another day, and this year what we're going to do is have some overlap time with the 2-year and 4-year institutions and organize everybody by region. And instead of thinking about kind of the measures and definitions and knowing that the data is there, we really want to say, these are, on these goals and targets, these are kind of the top performers, and we want to get to really a strategy level discussion about, hey, you decreased your excess semester credit hours by 5 over the last year, or 10 over the last year. What's going on at your institution that's really moving the needle? So that's what we want to focus on kind of in that March-April time period. The preliminary targets that we've put together will become official targets, and we'll call that gelled for a period of time. Every 5 years or so, we go back and look at our projections and see if we're still on target, but we'll kind of set them for a period of time. So that'll happen in May, and then by August, we'll ask for institutions and the regions to be identifying those 3 powerful strategies, as well as the institutional level completion targets. I showed these last time, and I will just do them very quickly here. If you want to have a deeper discussion, happy to talk about them, or you can pull me aside afterwards. But what we have here are the most recent 2015 actuals for the educated population goal. So you can see the range is from about 29% to 48% currently, and we're averaging 41% statewide, and we're aiming to get to 60%. You can see in the future, the projection for 2030, the range is from about 47% to 70%. Something I want to emphasize is that it's very important. We want every region to grow, and we would love to see every region hit that 60%. What we have here is sort of the minimum level of growth expected that we would need to get to that 60%. So this is kind of that minimum that we would need to see. Here are the completion, most recent actuals, 2016, and the projection up by 2030. You can see important contributions from every region. Obviously, the larger regions, Metroplex, Gulf Coast, Central Texas, South Texas, have some of the largest currently and the largest numbers in the projected future. And then finally, in the high school to higher ed enrollment, the preliminary targets here, you can see most recent actual, we're about at 52%. This is actually an area where we've gone down the last couple of years. We went from 54 to 53, now to 52%. So this is one where we really need some focused attention about working with K-12 partners to bring them into higher education. We have a very, very rapidly growing high school grad population. And even though enrollment in higher ed is growing, it's not growing fast enough to keep up with that growing number of high school grads. So that's the big challenge we're seeing here. So again, you can see the variation from about 61% to about 71% across the regions as we look to 2030. So I mentioned the starter kit that we're working on. These are some of the elements. I did just want to highlight a couple of things about the regional strategies. People have asked, how big is that? What does that mean? And I say that these strategies meet three characteristics. One is that they're relevant to 60 by 30 texts in one of these 3 areas. high impact, meaning that we think that it'll measurably move the needle for students, and large scale. So that means all or most students or all or most institutions in a region committing to something. But what I want to emphasize is that these do not need to be new novel things that are on the edges of innovation. These may be things that you are already doing, but could be doing in a more kind of coherently, strategically connected way to 60 by 30 TACC. So for example, all or most institutions in a region will scale guided pathways, and you might focus on selection of a broad meta major within the first year. So that might be something every institution wants to take their own way to get there, but that might be one of the strategies that you're focused on related to completion. And I know every community college is focused on this kind of area right now. Another example is to significantly increase the number of students who are successfully completing a gateway or developmental course by robustly implementing co-rec or supplemental instruction. So you may say that first year, those first couple of courses, we really want to support an improvement in student success in that area. So again, want to let people know these may be things you're already working on, but we want you to think about connecting them more explicitly to the plan. And here's another example of a completion effort. So it might be focused around transfer, for example, and it might be something like adopting the field of study curricula, embedding them in your existing programs, or participating in something, for those of you who might be participating in the North Texas Community College Consortium, the AAS to BAS guided pathways work. That is a fantastic example of regional work that's really kind of greasing the wheels for a lot of institutions to help clarify the pathways for students. Again, those strategies are just illustrative, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things people might do. Here's an example of the sample submission form, where for each region we would ask for that one strategy in the 3 areas here, and then the institutional completion targets. And in terms of updates, we have started our engagement with the South Texas region. We had a webinar November 14th. If you were not a part of that and you want to know more about it, we have the recording. I can send you the slides and send you the recording from that. It was a really good discussion, actually, and we had about 25, 30 folks. Institutional liaisons and presidents were invited, 2-year, 4-year independent institutions. And coming out of that, we had a recommendation that said, South Texas area is very large, and it's not going to be practical for us to work on this all together. What we'd like to do is have some kind of sub-conversations. And so we had volunteers. Bruce Leslie from the Alamo Colleges is going to convene the San Antonio area folks. We've got UT-RGV convening the lower RGV folks. And then Laredo, Corpus, Kingsville, Texas A&M International University is going to be convening them. So that's going to be next steps that we'll see for them after the first of the year. I mentioned the Data Fellows training. On November 16th, we had over 30 community technical college folks here. So there are people in many of your institutions that already have some key insights into this work. And we also identified staff to support each region. So that's something that we can do to help answer questions and help support your work as you go forward. So with that, I will just say we look forward to working with you, and I hope that you'll ask questions, spread the word, and say yes when we invite you to participate in a webinar come January, February. So, any questions or comments?
How are we getting this out to our colleges and universities? But I have had a desire to have a presentation of some sort, either at one of our board meetings or our spring board retreat. And it doesn't have to be a long item, and I don't know that someone on our faculty or board could not present it. Do you have maybe a starter PowerPoint or something?
Yeah, we can share some of what I have here and include that with the starter kit. And if you get in touch with me, I'd be happy to get all the materials to you. Yeah.
Jenna, I have a question about the goals. And so we want to have 550,000 completers by 2030. Mm-hmm. And so obviously if those are all doctoral degrees, it costs more money than if they're associate degrees and so on. So if you give any thought to the mix of that, and in particular how policy decisions might impact that, it's going to cost more to do one, and so state funding has an impact. And then really, I mean, the policy issue we've talked about today, dual credit. If we say, all right, we've grown as much as we want to grow in dual credit, we're going to cap it at that, how far do we get in this? I believe we don't get there if we do that. So have we done any what-if sort of scenarios around that and or not? And just sort of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so we are toying with the idea of something like a retirement calculator, like how much do I need to save now if I want to retire by the time I'm 60? You know, that's that kind of thing, because we're going to get there by a combination of enrollment growth and improving graduation rates. It's going to be a both and situation. But what I'll tell you is if everyone had graduation rates as high as our highest institutions, we have enough students in the system now to meet that goal. So is it reasonable to say that every institution is going to have a 100% graduation rate? Absolutely not, right? Then that suggests the quality has gone out the door or some, you know, at some point. So both and enrollment growth plus improving graduation rates. And what I'll tell you is that in the last 15 years, universities improved their graduation rates 14 percentage points, and community colleges, it was about 9.2 roughly. Percentage points that it's increased. So we're on a good trajectory here. We need to keep moving it. And honestly, we're going to get there we have got to have the support and the, you know, robust improvement in the community and technical college sector. You guys are where the opportunity, frankly, is. And I'll tell you that associate's degrees are the fastest growing right now. They're not the largest share, but they are the fastest growing. Bachelor's are the largest share. We have seen some concern around, hey, is everyone just going to go try and get a bunch of certificates because that's the easiest, cheapest way maybe to get over the hump. But what we're seeing is that, and we're asking and hoping that institutions will responsibly connect with their labor markets and decide what is it that's actually valuable for students, knowing that they're taking on debt and spending time and all of that. You know, we have not seen any evidence that that is happening. So it's something that people raise, but when we look at the numbers, we see steady, reasonable growth. It doesn't appear that anyone's doing that. And I do just want to clarify, we're tracking 4 credentials: certificates, associates, bachelor's, and master's, not PhDs or other professional graduate programs. And we have not laid out a specific split. We really want folks to tell us what's most relevant for you.
So in part of the discussions, how are you connecting to industry, statewide, regional level, about what their workforce needs are, in a sense, how they're changing in terms of what they're hiring? You know, we have a kind of academic approach about the 4 you just said, certificates, associate degrees. A lot of employers are actually moving to hire for competencies. They're offering their own programs to get whatever the certificate is, some sort of non-credit times. I mean, how are you factoring in kind of the changing marketplace for employers in terms of what they're looking at and valuing? And then secondly, it's sort of a separate question, but how do we tie in the 20 regions of K-12 and the TEA into this pathway and pipeline as they've got House Bill 5 and people are working their way up? How do we align those together in a way? And I think Jeremy just mentioned is that sort of the mix within the targets, because we could say 70%, but or 60% or whatever number for various regions, but what's the mix of what we need? Because we can get to that number but still not meet the needs of the regional workforce if they're the wrong mix.
Right. Well, I'll take the easy one first, which is there is a slide which I spared you today where we actually overlay the 20 TEA regions, the 10 higher ed regions, and the 28 workforce development boards, none of which are the same. And so it gives you a little bit of a headache when you look at all the colors and the squiggles. The only thing I'll say is that everyone uses county lines, but they all use different county lines to do that. So one thing we are doing is part of the tri-agency initiative. I'm representing the coordinating board on that and have been working with both TEA and TWC to inform them that this is coming, and they have offered up representatives from each of those other organizing regional units to participate in this work. So when we say we're going to do these kickoff webinars or when we're going to do additional follow-up meetings, those folks are informed and will be prepared, hopefully, to join. That's our aim. In terms of how to connect with business, I'll say that this is the area that I am least confident about. I don't have the answer for. I have a sense that part of getting to 60% is having the jobs that demand more education, and some of that's going to come from in-migration. We see that Austin has the highest level, or Central Texas has the highest level of attainment right now. Part of that is because we have a thriving tech sector that's bringing a lot of people in that require high levels of certification or credential. So how we engage business is, I know it's a key piece, and I think we're going to ask through this regional work for folks to come up and with ideas to help us do this better. So I think community and technical colleges are probably best positioned to think about this, and I think we need to learn from you all about what your advice is, and that's my personal answer. I don't know if Rex or Gary has a better answer.
And as an example of engaging with business and industry, we've talked to you all about programs of study, and it's a major initiative closely related to fields of study. And one of the things we're doing, and as an example, we had a group in here yesterday, and we're trying to take a good, aggressive look at both our WECM course inventory, and then trying to develop programs of study that transfer from college to college. And what that means is the statute has a section in it that says if a student is enrolled in a board-approved program of study at a college and they transfer to another college, you've got to sequence those courses. And just right now, nursing programs across the state, ADN nursing programs, commonality in them is just happenstance. And it's the same thing for all of our welding programs and any discipline you want to look at. We're trying to work with business and industry and faculty representatives to come closer together to a more common set of courses. We worked, I don't know, this summer or fall, I don't remember exactly when it was, with a group on drafting as an example. Collectively, they identified 4 courses, the faculty and the business people, that are being offered at the different institutions right now. And of those 4 courses, they said these courses are all basically the same course, and we use them all kind of sort of more or less the same way. But if we just tweak this like this and had one course, we could archive those other 4 courses, and we could all use this one course. So it gives us a higher level of commonality, and it moves us into more of a shared space. From that drafting meeting, the business and industry, we still had all of the drafting courses referring to blueprints, blueprint reading, and so forth, and that kind of stuff. And the industry folks said it's not blueprint reading. We haven't done blueprints in, I don't remember what number they said. I want to think they said 25 years. And it's like it's plan reading. And so that they're recommending those changes, and we're incorporating those into the programs of study and the initiatives. Right now we're working in architecture and construction and the health sciences, and then as we have time and resources, we're moving down the road almost parallel with what we're doing in fields of study. And then I guess one other thing, Jenna kind of mentioned the tri-agency. I work closely with my contacts at TWC and TEA to kind of make sure that we're aligning initiatives. John mentioned Hurricane Harvey earlier in the meeting, and shortly after the hurricane, we worked extensively as an agency with TWC, with local workforce boards, and then there was grants, and so there's many efforts working on alignment to try to get down that road. And then I guess last comment is every program, every technical program at every community college has an advisory board that's supposed to bring that business and industry piece together to have that conversation. So hopefully it is responding.
And so if I can blame this just a second, bear with me, I might explain it. So to use Austin as an example, our county and our mayor and our county judge have come up with a workforce master plan that's focused on 3 major areas that they want to get focused on: high tech, skilled trades or applied manufacturing, and healthcare. And they're really looking at also trying to upskill people who are unemployed or underemployed and to fill those needs, because we don't have enough people, because you're in migration. We can't afford, you guys tried to drive in here, right? We don't have affordability, we don't have transportation, so we want to upskill people to take these jobs. And we're looking at creating industry partnerships ourselves, but one of the things, we went and looked at Boston and gone to other places, that it's got to be industry-led. If we're trying to do it from the academic institution, here's what we're going to fill your need, the industry has to lead it. So we've created a healthcare partnership with our workforce board, and it's Seton, St. David's, Seton's now Ascension, I guess, but St. David's and Baylor Scott & White and some of the major healthcare employers, because we went and looked at Boston and what they do up there in terms of their massive healthcare collaborative and said, how do we go, what jobs do you need to fill? What do you need? What skills do they have to have? How do we fill them versus somebody else? They do it themselves because they do a lot of in-house training. And when you start looking at the tech space, we can look at these numbers, which somebody interested. What you've got is because there are some for-profit competitors that are coming into play that are General Assembly and others that are going to offer tech degrees or, certificates in some sort of programming language that someone can get potentially faster, maybe not cheaper, but potentially faster or more responsive in terms of their timing and needs, or employers are offering it themselves. So it's kind of, when you look at 60 by 30, it still seems to be very sort of historical academic focused, but I have a feeling that the marketplace by 2030 is going to look so dramatically different we can't envision what it's going to look like. And how does that set of metrics evolve to incorporate what really is needed? Because ultimately what we're trying to get people's jobs, right? So it's what the employment industry in our regions need, and that varies. And William knows from our Singapore and other stuff, there's a lot of differences between regions and what we have. And so I think healthcare is probably going to be persistent across everybody. But I must say, I'm not sure who's here from Houston, but Upskill Houston is an example we're looking at about one that they're trying to, it's very employer-led, about what are the sectors and jobs that they need and what kind of training they need to have. So I think somehow we need to be connected to that and conversant in it, so we understand how what we're trying to do fits into what industry and workforce needs in Texas.
So I really value those comments, and I may follow up with you with good ideas. I was at a SHEO event, State Higher Education Executive Officers event, where I was taking notes from Tennessee and Washington, have done kind of similar regional work. And what they said is you have to lead with the workforce. You have to know the demand and map backwards. And intuitively, I know that. But even how we talk about this work and who we engage, we haven't fully made that shift. And I did leave out that there is some new work, Jobs for the Future, and TEA have been working on some briefs that have kind of industry-relevant information. What are the growing industry jobs and skills, kind of broken out at different levels with different levels of credential that are just coming out now. So there is some research that we can provide to help guide that. But I think in terms of the relationship building and building a movement, that's where we need ideas and where we need to share and grow. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes left on our schedule and 2 items. And I'm going to suggest we take the least interesting item first, out of order, but maybe one of the most important, and just have a very brief discussion on the agenda items for the next meeting. What do we want to talk about? I mean, obviously, we had a lot of discussions on dual credit. That's interesting. What are people's thoughts? I mean, I'm not stepping on anyone's toes, but baccalaureate, we just learned 15% are interested in it. That may not be a topic we want to discuss every session. You may be able to break those people out into, some subsection. But does anyone have any ideas? And what do we want to talk about? What does this committee want to accomplish as far as gaining knowledge and also giving input?
Well, Mr. Chair, I'll offer to you that the 60 by 30 plan is one of the most powerful things we're going to do for a really long time. And one of the things that really encouraged us who work solely in the workforce development area is the marketable skills plank within that plan. Because in the end, the real test of a marketable skill is your graduate hired? That means an employer paid for those skills. And I think all of us in the sector have been struggling with marketable skills. I mean, I've heard lots of people wringing their hands over that and trying to define it. And Jenna just gave us an outstanding presentation in terms of how our new strategic plan is being done, but then had to admit one of the weaknesses we're struggling with is this marketable skills. The skills gap in Texas is never going to get addressed if 60 by 30 turns into another let's push more kids through the system and we don't have the end in mind when we begin. We have to have employability as our first target, not merely completion, not merely volume, but employability at the end. And if we at these kind of councils aren't talking meaningfully about what that looks like, if we aren't helping Jenna with how she engages employers, then we're just going to end up with another closing the gaps, which was really about volume. The marketable skills has to be, frankly, the first consideration, and then the volume will matter. Otherwise, we're just pushing more kids through higher ed. So this is something that if we as leaders in higher ed aren't grabbing that bull by the horns, engaging industry in a meaningful dialogue about what do you need 5 years and 10 years from now, then as a talent supply chain, we've abdicated our position.
Well, I love to plagiarize. I plagiarize with pride. I mean, I guess one question is, have other states done this? Have they tried to define it? And maybe that is one of the discussions to have Jenna lead that discussion, and maybe have you and some of the others volunteer to visit with her in January. And kind of, I hate to use the word subcommittee, but have some interaction with them, and I think after the meeting go to Jenna and say, yes, I would like to be part of that process, and I think it would be good. And again, Jenna, if you know that Tennessee's doing a great job, let's get Tennessee on the phone, you know, and see where they are. But I get the consensus, everybody nodding. That's one of the things we want to do next meeting, is talk about this marketability. Is that?
Well, that was my nomination for a topic.
I may be slow, but I think I caught it. Does anyone have any great objection to that? I hope you don't, Jenna.
No, I would love that. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
And I want to thank Mike as well. Coming from a technical college where essentially 48% of all our offerings are either non-credit or definitely in that technical space, and trying to meet the goals of 60 by 30, obviously marketable skills. I think someone used the term that there is no magic bullet, but so there is tremendous upside, as we all know, to marketable skills. But again, Mike, I think you were spot on about having that carrot at the end of the completion period and really meeting the goals of helping to close that skills gaps. So I think there has to be a multifaceted approach, particularly how we engage EDCs and chambers, as well as we have to circle back and get TWC more involved. I think TWC has done a great job in terms of its occupational demand list, but I think there's some perhaps some opportunities to even better define what that looks like as we move forward.
Chairman, I think the discussion with regards to marketable skills is one, obviously, that we need to move forward with. What I'd ask Jenna is a great report, outstanding report, and the 60 by 30 report, to look at it with regards to the 8th grade cohort report. Those two reports of where we are and where we're headed, if there can be some sort of cross-referencing of them, and the reason I say 60 by 30, I absolutely agree with the goals of 60 by 30, and we're doing all we can in El Paso and the El Paso region to ensure that we're meeting those targets. The 8th grade cohort data, I don't know how they mesh. Unless we're going to immigrate, we're going to have so much legal immigration come from other parts of the country to do that. I mean, so the highest area in the 8th grade cohort is 25% in Abilene of 8th graders receiving some sort of credential 11 years after high school graduation. So we're currently at 19%. We've improved 8 percentage points in the last decade in El Paso, more than any other region. But we're still behind the state. State's at 21 now, but the state's at 21. So how do we square 60 by 30 Texas when 21% of our 8th graders are getting a credential 11 years after they graduate? And there's, 5.5 million K through 12 students in Texas. So how do we make, fit that peg, that square peg into a round hole is something that I really worry about. With regards to employment, I am all in as well. And yet I look at our largest employers in my region, and 9 out of the 10 are public sector employees. And I'm willing to grow those areas. They're good, they're decent jobs, but, we talk about the private sector, and we have, it's 9th, I think, largest in those 10 largest employers in our region. It's tenet. Mr. Williams is absolutely right. It's a hospital, and we all know that healthcare is going to be an area that's going to be growing. I don't know what the other area is in my particular region outside of the public sector. So I think these are things that in each of our respective regions, and to make sure that the health of our state remains in a positive direction, we need to look at these particular pieces and how we square these.
Some issue that's eating at Mark?
This may tie into it a bit. So when we follow up just for a second, the marketable skills, I think there's two pieces. I can't remember if it was a coordinating board thing or South by EDU or something I heard, but employers were saying, technical skills are table stakes. The marketable skills are the other things that enable them to do the job, work with other people, learn on the job. Once the table stakes of that particular technical skill is no longer applicable because they learn to do something different. So it's kind of like, what does it really mean, a marketable skill? And the other thing is that maybe we're talking about where do we see the economy going as you start looking at this. I think yesterday CNN Money came out with a report. I don't have all the details, but it was actually a McKinsey Global Institute that said something like 375 million jobs, this may be globally, are going to be gone by 2030 because they'll be automated or they'll be replaced or some other technical improvement will eliminate the need for somebody to repair something. Something's now much better. You don't need all the technicians you might have needed before. Still may need them, but the improvement. So we got to be careful not about shooting a target that we think we have today that won't be the same target that we need in 2030, so that we may have people with credentials, but they actually may not have credentials that enable them to do a job in 2030. So what does that look like?
Yeah.
One comment on the accountability system measures. I'd like to look at the graduates with no more than 3 excess hours. It's a new requirement that's appeared, and with all the competition we've got out there with online courses and all the Governor's Western University that just came up with, I don't know how in the world you can hold us accountable for somebody that walks in the front door that's went to 4 or 5 different colleges and have accumulated a plethora of different stuff that doesn't apply to anything, and yet it's an accountability system. I like to drill that down a little bit because we've got a whole bunch of people that take classes all over the world in our college, and they come to Fort Hood and then they try to patch together all this stuff, and most of it is garbage.
So one thing that we've done to address that, I'll say that we look at excess hours overall, and then one of the contextual measures is the number of students who are then meeting that 3 excess hour. That is ultimately our goal for 2030, the target around excess hours. So we want to know how close are people now. One thing that we've done in that overall excess hours measure is to provide the overall. We also break it out by same and other, which means students who started with you and stayed with you and graduated. We have a breakout that you can see their average, and then you can also see folks who started somewhere else and then graduated with you. You can see that as well. So we think it's important to see both. There's 2 stories there. One is that from the student perspective, it matters that they racked up a lot of time and money. So we want to look at that whole picture. But we also think it's fair to say, let's take a look at they're different drivers of different problems, right? So if it's very high as a native student, then there are certain things that you might look at. We know that transfer and mobility is a big cause of excess hours. Either things don't apply to a particular program or don't transfer in a way that's useful to people. So both aspects are important, but we do think it's important to focus on the student side, which is that they have taken all those hours.
And I'll just add to that, or echo that we do think it's important to look at both those native students and those who students who have transferred. But if you think of it from the perspective of transfer, it is important, for example, for universities not just to think about those students who start with them and finish with them, but to look at excess hours and think about those students who do transfer in and think about other things that we can do to help reduce these hours in terms of our transfer policies. And I think that there's things that community colleges can do, that all institutions can do in terms of their policies when students do come in terms of thinking about what hours might count, what's most appropriate. Do they have policies that are really keeping students from getting the benefits of credits they've already earned? And it's a complicated scenario, but I think this particular target really helps focus attention on that. And I think that's what's important, is for institutions to have those conversations, but also for students to have an understanding of what excess hours are all about. And it's kind of like the debt goal. There's a lot of players involved. It's not just the institutions that affect what student debt is going to be. It's student choices. It's statewide funding. There's a lot of pieces to it. So I think at least this makes folks aware of where we are in terms of those hours. And Rex, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, just to add that like the debt goal, the no more than 3 hours of excess credit is also a statewide goal. It's not necessarily intended that at each institution you will have no more than 3 hours of excess credit for every one of your students. So in that sense, it's a statewide target, if you will, to try to reach on a statewide basis. So it's not really intended to hold each institution in that sense then accountable for not having more than 3 hours of excess for every one of their students.
Yeah, and thinking about individual students, you know, when we calculate this, we don't include students, for example, who have taken AP courses. We don't include courses that were completed while in high school, so that includes dual credit. So when the statewide, we were looking at the data for the statewide goal, there are many students who graduate with less than the hours for this purpose, whose hours are in the negative in terms of excess, because they might have taken 4 AP courses and gotten credit, and 3 dual credit courses and gotten credit. So statewide, you know, I did want to explain that that's how it's calculated, that we look at the point in time when the student leaves high school and starts. Some students take CLEP tests, and we don't have information about that. So as we calculate this, we're looking again at where we stand overall, and those particular hours aren't included. So I think that makes it, when people hear that, help them understand again that it might not be quite as aggressive a target as it seems. But certainly it is one that we've got a long way to go based on the data we have right now.
And you're right, it is complicated. We counsel our students on what to take depending on where they plan to go their first or second year. We have a very great transfer rate with our 6 university center partners who are on campus with us. But when the student gets an opportunity to go away their junior or senior year, the classes that they took that would have transferred to one of our university center partners are no longer accepted. And that's where the transferability thing is so important. In some ways, this reminds me of the opposite end, when the legislature discovered that we were providing remedial education to students coming out of the public school systems, and they didn't want to pay for it twice. Well, we were trying to get them ready for college. Maybe that, if they're ready for college when they come out of high school, we wouldn't have to worry so much about 3 additional hours.
We also don't count
I think
developmental hours.
If I may.
Yep.
I think my point was not to discuss these issues, but to figure out what we want to discuss next time.
Fair.
So I think that's very important, because now we have to turn back the clock, as the legislature does. So I think what Rex was saying, you said it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue. I think it makes sense to have that as an agenda item and fully discuss it, not run through it in 2 minutes. I mean, that's not a criticism. That's just a fact that's out there. And we have the 30 by 60, and I think the dual credit obviously goes on there. Transfer. What else do we want to talk about next meeting?
So Ron, I just make a point that we choose 3 or 4 topics. When we talk about them, we get the data and say, Jenna, what do you have? What do we need to know? So we can really understand the issue without worrying whether our anecdote is the right anecdote that applies to what's happening across the state, that we really look at the data and that we have enough advanced time that they're able to do that. And we commit to ourselves that when we don't have the advanced time, we give ourselves the time to do that, because that's really what's going to drive us back to his point, checking in. How are we doing? What's going on? Where do we need to go?
Well, and with the dual credit, I've heard on several occasions that we're going to be getting some information within the next 6 weeks, 2 months. And so if UT and TACC can come and make a presentation, if you could get the researchers up here, maybe some of the RAND people, and let's just drill down on, I've got 4 issues written down.
Mr. Chair, this is not an issue, but I was wondering, would it be possible to get some of the PowerPoint presentations prior to the meeting so that we could take a look at them before we actually were here on site?
That's a housekeeping question.
Yeah, we normally do send them early. We did kind of run a little bit behind this time just with other things, but normally we do try to get them to you in advance.
All right, thank you.
Very quickly, so do we have a consensus, really what we want to emphasize on and drill down on with as much data as possible is just the general 60 by 30 Texas dual credit with the recent studies, and maybe even have some guest speakers, the accountability issue that Rex was talking about, transfer, which we may or not get to today. Anything else that's just kind of burning that we really want to drill down on?
Well, we're going to also add to that list marketable skills, or is that a subset conversation?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that kind of fits in with, when I said 60 by 30, I meant including marketable skills. That's a good. And if there's a piece on legislative update, if some, we could throw that in too. And I guess it's to the pleasure of the council. It is 4 minutes after 4. We have a topic that could probably take a long time. Do we want to go ahead and hear that concerning transfer, or do we want to? That's one of the key items for next time. What's the pleasure of the council?
I'll have to leave at 4:06.
Rex, have you had all the fun you can stand today?
Yeah, and I would actually suggest that we just hold off on transfer. We continue our work on fields of study. One of the interesting things to me in the last couple of months that has happened in preparing for the major policy discussion, which was on transfer at the last board meeting, I came across a study, and we all know that transfer to 2 to 4 years is always conceived of as being the problem. Our data suggests that transfer from 4-year to 4 years just as, if not more, problematic for students. And then some data that I saw in a study, only slightly more problematic, suggests that the real most problematic part of transfer is from a 2-year to a 2-year, and which I find kind of interesting. So it might be that I'll try to dig up some more information on that. And of course, that's what the programs of study are designed to try to address, is that issue. And I'll tell you that my own personal anecdotal experience is that there is an awful lot of truth in that. It is really difficult to go from one 2-year institution to another 2-year institution for a 2-year degree and successfully transfer without starting over and losing a lot of stuff. And I think part of that is just because the idea of transferring from a 2-year to a 2-year is actually a relatively new phenomenon for folks. I think that there was always the idea that a student who started in a 2-year program was going to finish in the same place they started the 2-year program. And that's becoming less, and I think at one time that's exactly what happened, by the way. And so it was never much of an issue, but I think it's becoming more and more problematic for students who want to do that, but also who want to try to combine courses from different places, who spend a year at TSTC and then wind up in Houston and want to go to Lee or the Baytown or, you know, whatever the case may be. And so I think that's become more and more prevalent as students have become more and more mobile all the time. So anyway, we'll include some of that, and I think it would really be a good idea to just sort of leave it where it is for now, and then we can get into a much more extensive discussion of transfer at the next meeting.
And I just might throw something else out, and Jenna volunteered to have people give her a call or make contact with you. So I think if anyone is interested in any of these programs, you know, call these people and say, hey, I'm available for information, help, bounce things off of me, you know, work as a kind of committee, and Julie with accountability, and Rex with everything else. Ms. Elaine. Is there anything else to come before the council? One exception is the next date was, its suggested date is March 1st, which again is a Thursday. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, how does that compare to South by Southwest?
It's going to be in Killeen.
The meeting is going to be in Killeen? Are you moving the entire South by Southwest Festival?
I wouldn't even try to do that.
Yeah.
Is it going to be?
What?
I thought I got a invitation.
You should have already got a meeting invite for here.
Well, the only thing I would say is, you know, coming to Austin during South by for visitors can be really troublesome, and I just wonder if we've double-checked to make sure that that date is not during South by, unless it happens to be South by EDU.
So it's March 1st. I think South by EDU starts on the 5th, the next
Does it?
week, because it's a
Okay.
late spring break, and then the following week.
I think that's right.
Mayhem.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I just
But
wanted to
we'll
make sure.
double check that to make sure, because you're right. I mean, I live outside of Austin. I don't like to come to Austin during South by Southwest. So.
And I guess briefly, 10:30 is the best start time? Is 10:30? Is that?
We're all here almost for the first time since I've been on, but sometimes it's hard to get here. Can we join by remote access? I know previous chair didn't like that, but something to consider, Chair, and I'm about to
I have
leave,
no
so-
problems with that.
Yeah, that's kind of an ongoing discussion inside the agency, because we do have, there are state laws applicable to the Open Meetings Act that we have to adhere to. So we'll do some double checking on that again. We kind of go back and forth on this whole issue.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay.
But yeah.
Adjourned.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Good to see you. All right, I look forward to it.
Good to see you again. William? All right. Okay.
I like your expression, was it not transferable?
They'll say they all.